I cut her up into teeny-weeny pieces. It just became a part of my life, says Henry Lee Lucas, explaining that he would kill his prey employing a wide variety of methods and then usually sleep with the dead bodies. In this case, the victim he was talking about was his young girlfriend, but she was only one body among many, according to Texas police. How many? 150? 300? 600? 3,000? Surely not. That would make him the worst serial killer in world history. He makes Charles Manson look like Tom Sawyer. Americans in the 1980s heard from their TV news media. Lucas, they heard, was the worst of all time, a man whose crimes were so utterly dreadful, the cops almost fainted when hearing about him. Soon, police from all over the U.S. were talking to him about these 3,000 possible victims and the depraved things he'd done to them. But was Lucas telling the truth? Were those investigators telling the truth? Or was this one of the biggest corruption and police negligence scandals in U.S. criminal history, possibly exposing parts of the police and the American justice system far more insidious than any single serial killer? This is a case with many twists and turns. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into Mr. Lucas, as deep as it gets, presenting you, we hope, with the truth and nothing but the truth. You're going to need to understand how this man's mind works if at the end of the show you want to be confident about your decision regarding Lucas's serial killer standing. What made this man tick? Just how evil was he? Did he show any of those typical behavior patterns of serial killers when he was young? So let's first have a look at his childhood. Warning, it's not a pretty story. Henry Lucas, the youngest of 9 kids, came kicking and screaming into this beautiful world of ours on August 23, 1936, born into a very noisy and busy one-room cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia, the once wild frontier back when the English colonists in the 1600s were making America their home while fighting the locals. Lucas's mom, Nellie Lucas, was of Cherokee Indian stock, while his father, Anderson Lucas, could no doubt trace his roots back to those wandering colonists. Still, this was not the kind of family to sit around a living room happily discussing their family tree. This was the family from hell, and that is not an exaggeration. Before we show you that, you need to hear some important facts and statistics about families from hell and what their offspring might look like. If you look at common factors attributed to all serial killers' lives, you find that one of the most common things they had was a severe lack of childhood bonding with their mothers. Babies, while not strictly conscious of their world, form about 50% of their life knowledge during those early years. They learn about smells and sights, they feel vibrations, sometimes of love, sometimes of hate. It's well known in psychological circles that depriving a baby of love and affection shapes their entire life. Neuroscientists talk about how what happens in this stage of life can affect how the brain develops. It can shape how a person trusts and how they feel love, sympathy, or remorse. Babies are a sponge, and if you feed them anger or resentment or deprive them of affection, they will likely one day either turn as hard as a rock or ooze out those negative feelings in a negative way. In an FBI study undertaken on serial killers, it was found that only 57% of them had both parents at birth. In 47% of cases, the father left before they were 12. 66% of them had very dominant mothers, and 44% reported they had a very difficult relationship with their mothers. We don't need to tell you this, but children need love, and they really need it from the person whose body they came out of. Still, 72% of serial killers in that FBI study said that they had a negative relationship with their father or another male figure charged with looking after them during their childhood. It's also worth noting 50% of serial killers had parents with criminal histories and 53% with psychiatric histories. Kids with criminal parents in that study were 4 times more likely to commit crimes than kids without criminal parents. The strange thing is, these kids were still 4 times more likely to commit crimes even if they were adopted into families with no criminal history. But the most important factor of all that trumps everything is that children who become serial killers often have traumatic childhoods. Deny a baby affection. Keep doing that as he ages. But throw in regular beatings, belittlings, and bullying, and you're giving your child a much higher chance of becoming a murderous maniac. As the British poet Philip Larkin put it, man hands misery down to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out early while you can, and don't have any kids yourself. Talking about his childhood, Lucas once said that he enjoyed hurting animals, killing them, and doing other things to them we won't describe lest this video breaches some YouTube moderation rules. Lucas said his stepfather taught him how to hurt animals, especially animals of the canine kind. Bearing in mind what we just told you, it's important to know Lucas's mother Nellie often made money from selling her body on the streets. She seemed to resent Lucas, calling him a sissy boy, severely humiliating him by forcing him to go to school dressed in women's clothes. He got much more than maternal emotional abandonment. He felt the full force of motherly hatred. Lucas would later say about his victims, "I just hate women." His father Anderson, aka No Legs, was a serial alcoholic. He was wheelchair-bound due to a drunken night out when he was hit on some railway tracks by a slow-moving train, after which his legs were amputated. Anderson found a few ways to make $1 or $2 from his wheelchair. He sold pencils, he skinned minks, but he also had an illegal booze distillery and sold his hooch around town while always having enough alcohol for his own dire needs. By age 10, little Henry already knew how to run a small alcohol plant from his shack. If food ran out, he and his father would sneak around at night, looking through people's trash. When Nellie's male customers came to the house, there weren't many places to hide. Rather than find this embarrassing, she, a powerful and dominant woman, did her job on the dirty floor. She made Henry watch. Anderson was often there too. If Henry refused to watch, she'd pull out the club that she often used to beat him with. In his own words, he once said, "I was dressed as a girl by my mother, and I stayed that way for 2 or 3 years, and after that I was treated like what I call the family dog. I was beaten. I was made to do things that no human being would want to do." One of his earliest memories is of blood. He said a customer of his mother's had turned violent once, and she pulled out a gun and shot him in the leg with her shotgun. The blood went everywhere, including on Henry. He said this made him fascinated with blood. This was just one occasion where he experienced extreme violence from adults, and it was connected to sex, something that, as you know, happens in many serial killers' lives. When he was 13, his drunk dad went crawling around the house on what was a cold winter night. Lying there in the snow, he passed out and died. Lucas later said of his dad and how he'd felt about his mom having sex in front of him, she'd knock his brains out as soon as she would mine. He drank just to get away from it. He'd go out and lay in the snow to get away from watching her. That's what made him die. Nellie beat Henry even harder after his dad died, using broom handles and whatever else she could find. She'd beat him harder if he cried, all the time saying everything was his fault, that he was an evil child bringing bad luck to the family. One time, she beat him so hard over the head with a piece of lumber that she knocked him clean out. He spent the next few days in the hospital. Importantly, after this, he had regular dizzy spells and the odd blackout. This will soon become an important piece of information later. If you've seen a photo of Lucas, you'll know his left eye looked weird. That's because of the time he had a play fight with his brother, and his brother sliced his left eye with a knife. It couldn't be saved, so from then on, he had a glass eye. We should also add that prior to losing this eye, his mother ignored his injury for several days despite the eye looking really bad. If the story isn't already awful, the eye only came out after a teacher burst it by hitting Lucas with a ruler. We should also say the original injury was very likely an accident, not an all-out attack by his brother. With another brother, he had a sexual relationship. The two of them would also go looking for dogs to have their way with. Both boys were malnourished. They went to school and were pitied there by their teachers. One time, Henry came home with some shoes he'd been given in school as he'd gone to school shoeless. His mother took them off and beat the hell out of him for embarrassing her. Henry said the only thing he really loved in his childhood was his pet mule. His mother saw that, so one day she took her shotgun and made him watch as she killed it. She then gave him a beating and blamed him for the cost of someone being hired to haul the mule away. He once said in an interview, "My mother, if I had a pony, she'd have killed it. If I had a goat or anything like that, she killed it. She would allow me to love nothing. She wanted me to do what she said, and that's it." It all sounds unbelievable, like someone had invented the worst possible hell. But according to investigative historian and author of numerous books about serial killers, Peter Vronsky, Lucas's childhood history has been independently verified using various sources and interviews. Neighbors and people who knew the family have corroborated many of the events Lucas talked about. There were many witnesses to his mother's depravity. There were also the school teachers who agreed with Lucas when he said, "They ain't got, I don't think, a human being alive that can say he had a childhood like I had." Those school teachers confirmed that little Henry was sent to school in girls' clothes, something he obviously hated. It was later discovered that Nellie had done this so she could pimp him out in 2 different guises, therefore doubling the earning potential. There's more evidence of this. His shocked and saddened teachers managed to get a court order to stop his mother from doing it. Lucas said he was 14 when he killed his first person. She was a local girl, 17-year-old Laura Everline Burnsley. He picked her up, and when she rebuffed his advances, he strangled her. He later buried her body near Harrisburg, Virginia. He later said, "I got to playing too rough with her. The pressure of seeing my mom hit me, and my emotions more or less took over and I couldn't quite handle it." Burnsley's body was never found. Keep that in mind as we go on. This event was in 1951 when Lucas was already forever in trouble with the local police for a string of petty crimes. In 54, he was sentenced to 6 years in the Virginia State Prison after being found guilty of committing numerous burglaries. 3 years later, he escaped prison while working on a road gang. He headed to his half-sister Opal's house in Tecumseh, Michigan, and 3 days later, he was recaptured and sent back to prison in Virginia. He was finally released in 1959, after which he went on to live with his sister again. Nellie called the sister's house almost every day, screaming down the phone, demanding her son come back to her to take care of her. She was 71, no longer capable of beating him. But a mother like that will always have a psychological hold over their victim. When Nellie went to visit them at Christmas time, she found her little Henry was with a woman named Stella. The two said they planned to marry. Nellie was furious. No one was good enough for Henry. He was hers. In January, Nellie was screaming at him when she hit him in the head with a broom. No more, he thought, no more. He picked up a knife and stabbed her in the neck. He later said, "I was pretty drunk when she started arguing with me, wanting me to go back and live with her in Virginia, but I told her I didn't want nothing to do with her." He said when he hit her, he didn't even notice he was holding a knife. She fell to the floor, and when he bent down to pick her up, he saw the bloody knife clasped in his hand. He thought that she was dead, but when Opal got to the house, she saw that Nellie, while lying in a huge pool of blood, was still breathing. Opal called for an ambulance, but Nellie passed away before it arrived. The official police report said Nellie had actually died from a heart attack, but that it was the result of her first being assaulted. Lucas fled but was soon picked up in Toledo, Ohio, on an outstanding Michigan warrant. A state trooper had pulled him over and got him on the warrant, and Lucas later confessed in jail to killing his mother. When he stood up in court, he told everyone in attendance about his childhood, about the many scars on his body that his mother had inflicted all those terrible years when he was her victim. Carol Durst, the defense attorney, argued that there had been no premeditation, malice, or intent to kill. Witnesses, some of the members of the Lucas family, stood up and testified to the hell he'd been dragged through during his childhood. Still, he showed no remorse at all. Durst later said she became quite disturbed at how he'd tell her stories about what he did to animals. Don't forget that either, his total lack of remorse. Lucas said he'd only acted in self-defense, but the jury was having none of it. He'd killed her all right, but they thought it was second-degree murder. He hadn't planned it, but he'd known his actions could have killed her. Judge Rex Martin convicted Lucas and sentenced him to serve up to 40 years at Jackson State Penitentiary in southern Michigan. Nellie, it seemed, was having the last laugh. Could his life get any worse? The answer is a resounding yes. It could get much worse. Lucas sat in his cell on many lonely nights thinking about how his life had gone. And on those nights, he took his shame and anger out on his own body. That's how he ended up in Ionia State Hospital, the mental ward, a place in those days, the 1960s, where men and women were unwitting victims of experimental psychiatric procedures. Lucas was knocked out cold with various antipsychotic medicines, and he had his brain zapped time and again in electroconvulsive shock therapy sessions. He became zombie-like, but he was harmless, it seemed. On his patient file, he was said to be a very inadequate individual with feelings of insecurity and inferiority. In 1970, only 10 years into his sentence, the state had to do something about overcrowding issues. Some men needed to be released early, and Henry, a nice guy it seemed, was released into the wilds once again. Could this man, with that kind of past, become anything close to an upstanding member of society? We think you know the answer to that, but figuring Lucas out wasn't so easy. He became a drifter, human sewage floating down the river of American society, a now violent, perverted human who, with an IQ of 87 and not much hope of landing gainful employment, was always going to infect wherever he went. In 1971, he tried to kidnap 3 schoolgirls, for which he was handed a 5-year prison sentence. The details about the crime are scarce, but we do know upon his release he went to Port Deposit, Maryland, where he stayed with his half-sister, Almeda Kaiser, and her daughter, Aomia Pierce. After just 3 days, he headed to Chatham, Pennsylvania, with Aomia and her daughter in tow. It was through Aomia that he met a woman named Betty Crawford. The two hit it off. At first, they were just friends, but on December 5, 1975, they got married. Lucas was 39. In time to come, police will say Lucas was somewhere else on December 5, 1975. You'll find out why. Lucas had many jobs, but failed to hold most of them down. It's reported he worked for a while at a mushroom farm. Still, he rarely made enough to take care of Betty and her 3 daughters from another marriage. They all lived in a trailer park and partly lived off of Betty's Social Security payments. This was far from a marriage made in heaven. In 1976, Betty accused Lucas of sexual misconduct in regards to her daughters, something Lucas denied. She kicked him out regardless, and on July 7th, he hit the road with his worldly belongings in a single bag. He drifted around the U.S., learning the highways and byways, something that police would later take much interest in. On his way to Florida, he stopped off at Tecumseh, Michigan to visit Opal, and later with his brother-in-law, Wade Kaiser, he went to Virginia. For months and months, he drove all over the U.S., stopping in Shreveport, Louisiana, often going back to Virginia and Maryland, on to Wilmington, Delaware, spending time in West Virginia working in a carpet store. In Hinton, West Virginia, the location of the carpet store, he met a woman named Rhonda Knuckles. But soon he was off again, later going to stay with his sister Alameda and getting his job in a wrecking yard. She later threw him out after accusing him of sexual misconduct with her daughters. At one point, Lucas borrowed a car from a friend and never returned. After reporting it missing, it turned up conked out in Jacksonville, Florida. Lucas was not far away, broke and hungry. He headed to a soup kitchen, and this is where something very significant happened. He met another drifter, a man who admitted to Lucas that he liked to dress up in women's clothes. His name was Otis Toole. Sometime in the near future, these two will be discovered talking about barbecuing humans, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Otis's childhood was one of extreme horror, involving chronic abuse of every kind you can imagine. He had epilepsy, had quite frequent grand mal seizures, and was endowed with an IQ of 75. He spent much of his traumatic childhood living in abandoned houses after running away from his mother and father, who both did terrible things to him. Unbelievably, Otis's father did what Lucas's mother did to him, which was make him dress in female clothes for his own sick kicks. All manner of people hurt him in ways too squalid to say here. But we will say that Otis developed his own sexual sickness as a result of this. These two men were two rotten peas in a diseased pod. Otis invited Lucas to stay with his mother, Sarah, and her husband, Robert, who all lived in the same house as Otis's wife, Novella, a nephew, Frank Powell Jr., and his daughter, 11-year-old Frida Powell, aka Becky. None of them was concerned about Otis's bringing home strange men. He was bisexual, and this happened often. He'd sometimes get off on watching these men sleep with his wife. This man was the ideal candidate for a friend of Lucas, whose life wasn't that dissimilar. Lucas still had problems holding down work. He did a stint in a paint factory. He later got severely beaten up and spent several weeks in the hospital. On his return to life at the Toole home, he got into the scrap business, but all this time he was getting closer and closer to young Becky. Becky was also a very low IQ and had been in trouble with the law. Their relationship was cut short for a while when Lucas was arrested for stealing that car we mentioned earlier, and Becky was sent to live with her real parents, only after being sent to a children's shelter in Bartow, Florida, after her mother died. She later ran away from the shelter and police suspected Lucas had picked her up. We're condensing a few years here from the late 70s and early 80s. All this time, Lucas and Toole drove around the U.S. They loved driving. Lucas held down work for a while at a roofing company, but according to Lucas's later testimony, the two would rob small convenience stores and sometimes even small banks. Lucas said they were hellraisers. One time, he said they tied up a woman in a convenience store in western Georgia and, pointing a .22 at her head, said, "Move and I'll kill ya." She didn't move, but as they walked away with the bounty, he noticed her slipping her binds. He calmly walked up to her and said, "I told you not to move," and subsequently fired a shot into her temple. Lucas would tell the police, "Now, see, that's the difference between me and Otis. He just kills him when he feels like it. At least I warn him first." He would also say that while he was loading the stolen booze and the food into the car, Toole did terrible things to her dead body. Lucas would say the two often did this with their victims. We say victims in the plural. This was a few years of activity, by Lucas's account, activity of the utmost depravity. It included doing hits for what Lucas would later say was a bona fide American death cult he said was called the Hands of Death. We've left quite a bit out here, but we think we'll come back to that part of the story later. We'll say that in 1981, a young boy was playing Atari 2600 with other boys in Sears in Hollywood, Florida. 2 weeks later, his severed head was discovered in a drainage canal alongside the Florida Turnpike. This was massive news in the U.S., painted across every family's TV screen. It was one of those crimes that could make someone notorious. According to Lucas, Becky would often sit in the car when the two were getting down to their depraved business. At the start of 1982, Becky, now 14, was on the run from child welfare authorities. One day, Lucas put her in the car and the two headed to California. Toole told Lucas they'd meet up later and continue their activities, some of it involving hits for the death cult. Lucas would later say he and Becky did not have a sexual relationship, but one time after he'd slit a man's throat, she became sexually excited and the two hugged and kissed. Becky had seen everything, including the dismemberment and burying of bodies. This was even before they got to California. According to Lucas, he took Becky on a veritable ride into American hell, showing her things no girl should ever see as they passed through Oregon and into Washington. He would later say when he read about the Green River murders in the newspaper from the Green River Killer, he and Becky went out and murdered several prostitutes. When they finally got to California, they met a man named Jack Smart. He owned an antique shop in a small township named Hemet. Smart took pity on the bedraggled-looking pair. His wife later described him as one-eyed drifter with his child bride. Still, Smart fed them and gave them a bed to sleep in. The Smarts got them a place to stay, and Lucas worked hard as a kind of handyman for Smart. Smart would later note that Lucas often went missing in his car, presumably enjoying life on the road. After a few months, the Smarts got news that their 82-year-old relative Katie Kate Pearl Rich was not very well. The lady lived alone in Ringgold, Texas, but as of late she'd become unable to take care of herself. The Smarts had an idea. Why not send Lucas and Becky over there? They could look after Kate and live rent-free, and everyone's a winner. While Kate fed them, housed them, and gave them free cigarettes, Lucas was soon spending much of the food money Kate gave him on booze. He'd turn up at the local store whose owners knew Kate well and buy stuff they knew Kate would never buy while cashing checks in Kate's name. The clerk soon called some of Kate's other relatives in Oklahoma, after which they arrived at the house. It was filthy, littered with unwashed clothes and cigarette packs, and there was a sink piled high with dirty dishes. Becky and Lucas were out on the couch happily dozing. They were soon handed some bus fare and told to scram, but Lucas told Becky they'd keep the money and hitchhike. That's how they met Reuben Moore, a preacher from nearby Stoneburg, Texas, who was the Pentecostal minister at a religious commune called the House of Prayer. He took them in and gave Lucas a job as a roofer. There was one condition: Lucas had to work and Becky had to learn to cook, sew, and clean. They also both had to agree to attend church services. Becky apparently changed her ways. As they'd not traveled far, she was still able to see Kate, but this time she really did do the work. Then one day she told Lucas that since she was now a good Christian woman, she would repent for her many sins. She told him she was going to head back to Florida and hand herself in to the authorities, who were still looking for an escaped child. She said she'd say nothing about him or what happened with Otis. She just wanted to come clean and lead a more righteous life. He said the least he could do was go with her, especially since she was planning to hitchhike, which was dangerous for a 15-year-old girl. Now let's skip a bit of the story. On June 10, 1983, Texas Ranger Phil Ryan arrested Lucas on charges of unlawful possession of a firearm. This was not out of the ordinary for Lucas, who had firearms charges in the past. Little did Ryan know at the time that Lucas had been in custody earlier after a car he'd been known to be driving was found by the California Highway Patrol. There was blood on the seats, which Lucas said was his. Prior to this, the relatives of Kate had contacted the local sheriff, Bill Hound Dog Conway, saying Kate was missing and that she'd been seen with Lucas. The cops interviewed Lucas, but in the end they had nothing to keep him in custody, and off Lucas drove, heading through New Mexico back to Oklahoma and on through Missouri, Indiana, and Illinois, where he would later say he held up convenience stores and killed anyone that stood in his way. Lucas drove and hitchhiked his way around, at times getting odd jobs, but in the end he contacted the House of Prayer by phone and said he wanted to come back. He told the minister that he'd been trying in vain to find Becky, who'd gone missing. At this point, the minister was aware that Lucas now might be involved with the disappearances of two women, Kate and Becky. He called Sheriff Conway, and they hatched a plan to bring Lucas back to the House of Prayer. The minister sent Lucas $100 and told him to come over. He was missed, said the minister. It was some days after Lucas's return to the House of Prayer that the minister saw Lucas had a gun. Now there was a reason to arrest him. Conway believed that Lucas definitely had something to do with these missing women, but he needed an excuse to bring him in. A phone call between the minister and Conway led to Lucas being arrested again. Something had changed in Lucas, this time in jail. Maybe he felt it was the end of the line. He'd run so much and perhaps he could run no more. In that cell, he wrote a letter addressed to the sheriff. It included the lines, "I have killed for the past 10 years, and no one will believe me. I cannot go on doing this. I also killed the only girl I ever loved." In Lucas's attempt to spill the beans, he explained that he'd been drunk one night with Becky, and the two had gotten into a fight over where to go and what to do. "That was it," Henry told the cops. "I just stabbed her with my knife. I just picked it up, brought it around, and hit her right in the chest with it. She sort of sat there for a little bit and then dropped on over." He then went into graphic details about, how do we put it, having relations with her corpse. He said he took a ring off her finger, chopped her up, and put the pieces into pillowcases. He explained that he'd killed so many times before, but this one murder was different. He claimed to have loved Becky. He said her voice from the grave haunted him, But what happened to Kate? When Lucas returned to the house of prayer, people soon started asking where Becky was. The one person who asked that the most was Kate, who had taken a liking to Becky after seeing her conversion. She called Lucas at the house of prayer, and Lucas and Kate arranged to meet in town, and he'd explain the whole story. He told Kate that Becky had just taken off when they stopped at a truck stop in Texas. Kate, knowing Becky's transformation and plans, didn't believe him. She kept questioning him in the car when he was taking her back to the house. That's when he snapped. He pulled down a dark dirt road, took out his knife, and stuck it into her chest. He did his thing with the corpse and then dumped her, returning later with garbage bags and a knife. He said he cut her up and buried the bags, then returned to the house of prayer. A problem for Lucas was the minister now knew who the last person to see Kate alive was. You already know the minister will later inform the cops about Lucas's gun. You also already knew that the car he dumped was found with blood on the seats and that police had already picked him up before and had let him go, but now in his jail cell he was admitting to the murder and giving all the details. The only problem was, even though Lucas could take them to see body parts, the coroner couldn't positively identify either of them. Even so, it had to be him, surely. How else would he know where to take the cops to find their buried body parts? Lucas was talking, and by God, could this man talk. The so-called legendary Texas lawman, Jim Boutwell, was the sheriff. He seemed to treat Lucas like a son, giving him daily milkshakes, steaks, and a seemingly endless supply of cigarettes. Lucas looked up to him like a father, and let's remember here that Lucas had never in his life been shown maternal or paternal love. Now he was the apple of someone's eye, so he talked and talked for Boutwell. Lucas explained what we missed out on earlier, that he and Otis had gone on an almost countrywide killing spree, murdering for fun, money, and for the death cult. Lucas sang like a canary, admitting to hundreds of murders. At this point, Toole was already in custody elsewhere. Cops had him on a murder charge unrelated to the alleged mass murders he'd done with Lucas. Toole then told the police it was he who killed and decapitated little Adam Walsh, the boy who went missing from the Sears store. We should mention again that Toole had a very low IQ. He was, in fact, quite a few sandwiches short of a picnic, as the saying goes. Lucas backed Toole up, saying yes, Toole killed the kid. There was meager hard evidence, though. In terms of Toole's alleged crimes, which he perpetrated alone, the evidence was weak and would remain weak. As for the hundreds of murders that Lucas told cops they'd both committed, Toole denied it at first, but later changed his mind. The two men were suddenly famous, receiving more attention than they could have dreamed of. They were treated like rock stars, not even handcuffed when interviewed, and always able to get hold of cookies, snacks, and drinks, and enough cigarettes to fill the shelves of a convenience store. Lucas described how they'd driven from state to state, slitting throats, shooting people, almost always doing things with the bodies. He later said he and Otis had parted ways, and he carried on killing, picking up hitchhikers, meeting women in bars, and in his own words he said, "I killed him every way there is except poison. There's been strangulations, knifings, there's been shootings, there's been hit and runs. I didn't have any emotions. I had no feelings for the people themselves or any of my crimes." One time he and Otis got on the telephone and started talking about drawing blood from victims and then barbecuing the body parts that tasted just like meat. Low IQ or not, they must have known someone was listening in. Clementine Schroeder, aka Sister Clemmy, would go to Lucas's cell at the behest of the cops, and the next day he'd be back with his milkshake and new pack of smokes, telling the police about more murders. At first it was like 150, then it went to 300, then 600. One time he said he'd killed 6 in one day. That was his record. He'd even said he'd killed government officials, and there was a little black book somewhere with all the details. The U.S. News was then telling folks at home that what cops had on their hands was not just the worst serial killer in U.S. history, but the entire world, hands down, the devil incarnate. The Lucas Task Force was set up by the Texas Rangers, along with the Texas Department of Public Safety, a department you should not forget the name of, as soon we'll have a lot to say about them. The task force was headed by Sheriff Boutwell, who was now looking like the cat that got the cream. He'd stand for photos with his fancy gun and his engraved handle, often being called the best cop in America. More cops came from all over the U.S., clearing murder cases every time they talked to Lucas. Homicide departments from Virginia to Florida to Texas were having the time of their lives. It looked like a TV game show called Clear the Case. They'd take Lucas to the crime scenes, later telling the press that Lucas had explained to them things only the culprit of the murders would know. Lucas had a lawyer who watched as his client dug his own grave. He later said it was maddening working for someone who was actively working against you. That's because the lawyer knew for a fact much of this made no sense. Becky and Kate made sense, but not the others. This talk about a death cult, about eating people, it all sounded like the mind of a fanaticist who for the first time in his entire life was getting some attention. Lucas obviously felt like he was worthy of respect and that he was doing something good. Later, a journalist named Hugh Ainsworth did his own investigation. He looked at the cases, he interviewed the families of the victims, he even spoke to Lucas, who he said privately told him he was lying but he wanted to die. Ainsworth wrote all of this down in a story that would itself become famous, showing how if Lucas had done what the cops had said he'd done, he would have had to be driving 24 hours a day. In a beat-up car, he was covering thousands and thousands of miles, not stopping, and then after one murder doing the same again and again and again. Lucas covered more distance than if he'd driven to China. It was physically impossible for him to have killed all the people the police said he killed. Then it became clear. It was seen in a video that the police had given Lucas a huge book to look at. The book was full of crime scene photos, dates, names, places, and bodies. Lucas would get some time with this, and he'd start talking about his crimes. He might have been slow, but his memory was good. He'd been taught how to confess, how to run through all the details. So had Toole, it seemed. But he would later die from cirrhosis while in prison, so his story stops here. In a strange way, these two men probably loved each other. They had photos of each other on their cell walls. They were also maniacs, but were they as bad as was being reported? After Lucas admitted to killing a woman known only as Orange Socks due to her body being found wearing orange socks, Boutwell even admitted he'd refreshed Lucas's memory. Then a roofing company supervisor named Fred Ellis came forward and said there was no way Lucas could have killed Orange Socks. He said Lucas was working that day in Florida, far away from Texas. He had Lucas's clock-in card. He had his signature. Other people came forward too. Far from being a loner, many people knew Lucas. They'd also said he'd seen him that day. How was he supposed to travel 1,100 miles in a day and be back for work the next morning? Even so, the police still said his stories checked out. Families, for the most part, hated the press for saying Lucas might not be some record-breaking serial killer. They wanted closure. Lucas's lawyer knew the only way to turn this around was to get Lucas to take the stand. Lucas agreed, but the next day he changed his mind. The lawyer said someone had got to him. Lucas was a killer, but what kind of killer was the question? Was he an Attila the Hun, or was he just a sad, traumatized, attention-seeking man with a low IQ, vulnerable to smart cops who needed to clear cases? The TV news wasn't really asking that question. News reports would flash up saying Lucas was telling police, details so exact authorities found it frightening. Maybe so, but after they'd given Lucas the details. The distinction matters, although the TV media would not have known about that part. Joyce Marie Lemons, the mother of murder victim Debbie Williamson, was irate. She knew very well this was not the truth. She and her family knew the cops were lying. They spent years doing their own investigation and figured out that Lucas was in a different state at the time Williamson was brutally stabbed and killed. They found out that Lucas had been shown photos of the murder scene prior to him admitting to the crime. "We were mad. We went straight to the media," they said. Their investigation was sound. There was no way Lucas could have killed their daughter. Even Betty Crawford came forward saying Lucas was down for one murder on the day they got married hundreds of miles away. Remember December 5th? How had the police missed such huge details, like when and where he got married? It was as if they weren't trying because they wanted to close cases. The Lemons family found out that Lucas was in a different state for another of the murders. They interviewed many people and discovered that these people who had been with Lucas could prove it and sometimes had documents to show it. These people had never once been questioned by the police. The Lemons sought to take their case higher. There was hope when Vic Feazell, the district attorney in Waco, Texas, got involved. He could not believe his eyes. He soon started investigating the case himself. Meanwhile, Lucas, now serving a death sentence, started saying he hadn't committed those crimes and that the cops had fed him all the information. As Feazell was getting ahead with his investigation, the Texas Department of Public Safety, headed by a man close to the top dogs in the FBI, defended the Texas Rangers. This man, James B. Adams, was a former acting director of the FBI. He had a lot of political power, and he didn't like the fact that his Texas Rangers were being badmouthed. One day, Sheriff Boutwell, agents from the FBI, and the head of the Texas Department of Public Safety all had a secret meeting. This would not come out for quite a while. What was discussed at the meeting is still a mystery, but you can take a guess. Soon, Feazell found his house was illegally wiretapped. His dog, who barked at the wiretappers, was killed. He received phone calls at night saying he was going to be taken out. His wife once said someone called and said, "We have a bullet with your name on it." Someone in high places wasn't happy. Feazell was about to expose one of the biggest scandals in U.S. law enforcement history, but before he could do that, police raided his house one morning. They went through everything, took all of his documents, found a toy plastic syringe from his son's play doctor kit, and noted it as narcotics paraphernalia. You could almost hear the booming voice of the shadiest part of U.S. law enforcement and justice saying, "This is what you get when you mess with us." Feazell was released on bail after being charged with accepting bribes from attorneys. Even though he was innocent, somehow the FBI got hold of documents that stated he'd taken the bribes. Some attorneys had turned on Feazell, probably in fear of their careers. Feazell was looking at 80 years in prison for bribery, racketeering, and other charges. He later said, "I could not believe the U.S. justice system could do this." Of course, people asked if it had anything to do with the Lucas investigation and the fact that Feazell was about to expose it, but the district judge reminded people there was no link. No, nothing like that. To cut a long story short, Feazell was found innocent. The bad apples won. Feazell later found out through investigations and Freedom of Information requests that he'd been set up, that some people that had went against him had gathered their evidence from a WFAA TV expose. Feazell later took his case to trial and was awarded $58 million judgments for libel charges against WFAA TV, which at the time was the largest libel judgment in U.S. history, later to be settled. Feazell was done with the justice system. He'd lost all faith in it and so retired. But his and others' work proved that Lucas could not have committed all those crimes. It was now obvious the Texas Rangers had lied, although they still denied it, only admitting to some sloppy police work at times. They still had convictions for 11 homicides, including those of Kate and Becky, and importantly, they had Lucas on orange socks. Lucas was still going to be executed, even though it was now evident he couldn't have possibly killed Orange Socks because he hadn't even been in the same state. Lucas was definitely a liar, he was definitely violent, and he was definitely sexually perverted, but it was starting to look like he was no serial killer. Texas Governor George W. Bush finally stayed his death sentence when it was obvious to anyone who cared to look that Lucas had not killed Orange Socks. It was discovered that not only had Boutwell fed him steaks and milkshakes, but Lucas had some kind of nervous breakdown while in jail, and then he'd been given lots of strong medications at the time he was talking about murders and death cults. He then underwent extensive neurological tests, which showed his brain was damaged. There was extensive damage to his frontal and temporal lobes, which might explain his strange behavior. This could have happened when he was beaten as a kid, as it was found out he'd had seizures after one of his mother's beatings. Researchers said such abnormalities might also have something to do with childhood malnutrition. CAT scans revealed that his brain defects were consistent with diminished control over violent impulses. Then there was the story of Rita Salazar and Kevin Key, two youngsters who had been brutally killed. Lucas had been accused of their murder and admitted to it at the start, yet DNA evidence, which then was quite new, showed it to be a different man, later arrested and convicted. There was also Betty Thornton, a murder which Lucas admitted to, so the man charged with her murder, Scotty Scott, son of a policeman, walked free. It couldn't have been Lucas, as it was later shown he wasn't even in Texas. He was in Florida at the time of the murder. Scott was retried, but the case against him was dismissed. There were other cases when Lucas knew all the details, such as a necklace worn by a woman, but it turned out it couldn't have been him. So how did he know such specific details about the murders? The families of the victims saw this on TV and realized they'd been mad at the wrong man. Many came forward. The Cold Case Foundation got involved and did its own investigation, showing how utterly ridiculous the case was against Lucas. They said the only pattern was there was no pattern. No consistency, no pattern, no modus operandi, no signature, no hard evidence, just the words of a fanaticist with a nightmarish life story. The foundation presented a 32-page report to the Texas Rangers showing their findings, but received no response. DNA evidence had proven Lucas could not have murdered 20 of the people his name was tied to, but they had him tied to 3,000 cases. For the people he was convicted of killing, even Kate and Becky, whom he probably did kill, there's never been one scrap of evidence outside of his confession. He might have killed some people close to him, maybe not. In 2019, Orange Socks was identified through DNA as Deborah Jackson. She'd been murdered, but with high probability not by Lucas. It was the same as thousands of other cases, but if Lucas hadn't killed those people, who had? Police wouldn't reopen most of those cases, although over the years some have been reopened. Police departments now know huge mistakes were made here, perhaps just through willful blindness rather than rampant corruption. In detective circles, they now call this Henry Lee Lucas syndrome. Be careful what you wish for, they say, when things look too good. Don't believe everything you hear, even if believing it makes your life easy. On March 12, 2001, Lucas died from heart failure. He was 64. Right up to his death, he told lies, lots of them. But he might well have been telling the truth when he said, "I am not a serial killer." August 27, 1964, Grandma Kemper is sitting at the kitchen table editing the manuscript of her Boy Scouts book, Boy's Life. Her 15-year-old grandson Edmund walks up behind her and puts 2 bullets in her head. He then stabs her 3 times. He later explains to police why he did it and just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandma. That's brutal. But in the great scheme of things, it was the least shocking of Edmund Kemper's crimes. To know the man, you have to know the child. Ed Kemper was one disturbed kid, but it's not surprising when you hear some details about his life. That day, when he shot his grandma, someone he loved dearly, he then stabbed her 3 times, and he said he had to make sure she was well and truly dead because he didn't want her to suffer. After that, he carried the body up to one of the rooms, and he waited for his grandpa to get home from grocery shopping duties. When he heard a car pull into the driveway, he greeted this man he also loved dearly. With shopping bags in his arms, Grandpa Kemper smiled widely and said, "Hey, buddy." Ed later told the police, "When he turned, I placed the rifle this far." He used his forefinger to demonstrate the distance from the back of his head and shot him. By the time Ed was 15, he was already messed up, although we think we didn't really need to tell you that. This kid, massive in height and build with a very high IQ, was not like other kids. He wouldn't be like other adults either. Unless it's not that unusual to sleep with the heads of the women you've killed. Kemper blamed his mother for that, for the most part at least. Clarnell Kemper wasn't easy to please. She'd grown up wanting only the best. She was intelligent and very ambitious in high school, expecting to marry the ideal American Prince Charming. She got what she wanted, too. After finishing school, she became president of the National Federation of Federal Employees. She stood at a great height, both figuratively and literally, but even the best wasn't good enough for her. That's when she met Ed's father, also called Edmund. He was a behemoth of a man standing 6 foot 8 inches. He wasn't a man to be messed with, his status as a Special Forces commando in the Army impressing the hard-to-please Clarnell. Then Ed Sr. went to war, fighting in the Devil's Brigade, an outfit known to take on the riskiest missions from which many soldiers did not come back. In one such mission, fighting against an elite German squadron, he was only one of 23% of his battalion to come back alive. When he got back to the U.S., to Clarnell, he was wounded both physically and mentally. He was a changed man, no longer the dashing soldier that Clarnell admired. He was downbeat and depressed, having discovered hell on earth in the war. She became disappointed in him, crestfallen that her hero was all too human. He later said that facing his nagging wife was more difficult than facing the German elite soldiers. The atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her, he said, adding that she did more damage to him than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did. You might wonder, why are we telling you all this? The answer is, this story can't be told without knowing something about Clarnell. Leaving her out would be like talking about a malignant tumor and not mentioning the cause of cancer. On December 18, 1948, their second child was born. His name was Edmund Emil Kemper III. He was the malignant tumor, the product of a cancerous relationship. He grew up with his mother after Kemper Sr. could not take it anymore and left the family home. Now young Ed became the sole focus of Clarnell's frustrations and failures, belittling him at every opportunity she got. Growing up, his mother used his sisters to bully and harass him. He was made to feel shame about himself, something from which his mom derived much enjoyment. For that, young Ed would sometimes cut off the head of his sister's dolls. As you know, he'd be preoccupied with the heads later in life. One time, his sister teased him about his crush on his teacher, to which Ed replied, "If I kissed her, I'd have to kill her first." Fearing her own son, Clarnell locked him in a basement in the dark, making him sleep there with the scurrying rats. As he got taller, she moved his bedroom down there for good, turning the key to the sounds of his sobbing. There, he fantasized about violence, once beheading the family cat on his return upstairs. He kept the skull in his closet. Meanwhile, Clarnell tried and failed to meet a man that lived up to her very high expectations. For all her woes, she blamed Ed, the product of the man that had left her. Ed cried for days on end, pleading with his ma to let him go live with his pop. His father eventually took possession of young Ed, although he quickly moved the teenager in with his parents, Edmund Sr. and Maud, where they lived on a farm. They adored the child, showering him with love and gifts. One of those gifts was a .22 rifle, which, unbeknownst to them at first, Ed used to kill just about every single animal in sight. When summer came, he was returned to his mother. He later went back to the farm a changed boy. He killed more animals with that rifle, after which his granddad confiscated it. You know what happened next. Ed was subsequently sent to a psychiatric institution. There, doctors remarked on Ed's friendly demeanor and high intelligence. He was called a sociopath, but a boy with outstanding qualities who could use those qualities for good in the right environment. All the time, Ed was well aware of how to manipulate the doctors that treated him.
After all, his IQ was near genius level. At age 21, he was released and sent back into the heart of the furnace that founded him, aka his mother's house. Almost immediately, they had what he later called vicious battles. He got a job working for the California Highway Department and also got his own place. Still, his mother kept tabs on him, calling him nightly to complain. Ed called her a manipulating, controlling beast, echoing what his father had said. Something was about to blow. May 7, 1972, Ed, now 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighing in at 280 pounds, was driving his car down the freeway when he spotted two young women hitchhiking. They were Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. He then picked them up, although somewhere on the journey they realized he wasn't going in the direction that he said he would go in. He then stopped the car at a quiet area and got into the back seat. There, this huge man put handcuffs on Pesci and took Lucchesa out to the trunk. He later remarked of sitting with Pesci in the back. I was really quite struck by her personality and her looks, and there was just almost a reverence there. There was absolutely no contact with improper areas. He said what bothered him, though, was the fact that he might have accidentally brushed up against her breast. Embarrassed, he said to her, "Whoops, I'm sorry." This was a man that was about to kill her. Just after the apology, he put a bag over her head and stabbed her to death, slitting her throat at the end of the attack. He then went to the trunk and did pretty much the same to Lucchesa. But the act of killing wasn't what actually thrilled Ed. He wasn't a sadist per se. What he wanted was complete control over his victims' bodies. The killing was just a necessary act for what he wanted to do later. He took the bodies back to his apartment, where he dissected them and beheaded them, later remarking how he heard a little pop when their heads came off. Again, he told detectives there was absolutely no contact with improper areas, although this was certainly a lie. Ed said he just sat there looking at their heads when at one point one of them fell off a chair and made a loud noise on impact with the floor. He later told the detectives, "The neighbor hates my guts. I'm always making loud noises at night. He gets a broom and whacks on the ceiling. Buddy, I say, I'm sorry for that. I dropped my head. Sorry. That helps bring me out of the depression." He also said that he had fallen in love with Pesci, or what remained of her. He went back to the grave where he buried part of her, talking to her like a boyfriend. He told detectives that he was well aware of his twisted psyche. He knew what he had done was demented, but it just felt right to him. He then said words that have gone down in history. "When I meet a pretty girl, one side of me says, I'd like to talk to her, date her. The other side of me says, I wonder what her head would look like on a stick." Just for you serial killer geeks out there, these words were once wrongly attributed to Ed Gein in the movie American Psycho. Ed told police he didn't have the confidence to actually meet a woman and start a relationship. Instead, he made dolls out of them. They were more manageable that way. It was only a matter of time before he made another doll. On September 14, 1972, he picked up another hitchhiker. She was named Aiko Ku. He killed her and then went for a beer at the local pub. Halfway through his beer, he couldn't resist going back to look at the victim in the trunk of his car. He said he admired his catch like a fisherman. He did with her what he'd done with his first two victims. He buried most of the body parts, but he saved her head. When he went to see a psychiatrist for one of his regular appointments, her head was in his car trunk. This is what the psychiatrist wrote in the report that day. "If I were seeing this patient without having any history available or without getting the history from him, I'd think we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who has an initiative, intelligence, and who is free of any psychiatric illness. I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be a danger to himself or to any member of society." A second psychiatrist that day added his own thoughts. "I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records." The doctor added that he was glad Ed had gotten rid of his motorcycle, something he said was the only threat to himself or anyone else. Ed's record was wiped on those recommendations. He then went back to live with his mom after getting injured at work. In January 1973, he picked up Cindy Shaw. He snuck her body into his mom's house and dissected it the next morning after draining it of blood in the bathtub. When he finally buried the head, he put it in the garden facing up to his mother's bedroom. He later said he did that because his mom always wanted people to look up to her. Now that a few young women had gone missing in the same area, police told students not to get in cars with strangers. They still did, though, and on occasions with Ed. One reason was the fact he sounded so articulate and with his spectacles looked quite academic. But also because, due to her work, his mother's car had a university car park sticker on it. In February, Ed killed two more women. They were Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu. He did the same with them, playing with his dolls when his mother was sleeping in the next room. Later, he explained to police why he was so fascinated with the heads of his victims. The head trip fantasies were a bit like a trophy. You know, the head is where everything's at. The brain, the eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid you cut the head off and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Still, part of him knew he had to stop. Ed Kemper knew he was crazy. He understood the duplicity inside him. Maybe he thought one particular trophy might end my madness. April 20th, 1973, it was then that Ed finally decided to fight the demon he'd been fighting all his life, his mom. That night, she'd arrived home drunk as usual. Ed walked into her room as she was reading a book. He just stared at her, and she said in a belligerent manner, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." He walked back out of the room. At 5:15 a.m., she was sound asleep in her bed. Ed walked in and hit her over the head with a hammer. He grabbed her moaning body and slit her throat. He stood there just looking at her, thinking how weak she was. He asked himself how this thing in front of him had managed to have such power over him his entire life. He cut off her head and put her larynx into the garbage disposal, taking much enjoyment from that part. He said he did this because of all the complaining she'd done throughout his life. But when he turned on the machine, the organ wouldn't quite go down. He later told detectives even when she was dead, she still wouldn't stop expletive at me. I couldn't get her to shut up. What remained of her head he placed on a shelf and screamed at it for an hour or so, intermittently using it as a dartboard. Ed then got on the phone and talked to his mother's closest friend, Sally Hollett. He told her he'd arranged a surprise party for his mom and could she come around the house. He killed her too, sleeping with her head in his mother's bed. It was at that moment that he realized something. There had been no need to kill anyone except his mother. He later recalled his decision to stop killing. The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. He drove to a call box many miles from home and phoned the police. He told cops he'd killed his mother and her friend, but they didn't believe him and told him to call back later. He then called back again, this time asking to talk to a cop that he knew. One of the reasons Ed had gotten away with his crimes is he used to drink with the police at a local bar. They'd tell him about their hunt for the killer. No one ever expected Ed, the amiable, clever fella, to be a killer. He later said in interviews that when his victims got in the car with him, they'd discuss the terrible maniac doing such terrible things. He'd think, man, how come they never suspect someone like me? It was this high IQ and obvious capacity to fool others that made Ed Kemper the focus of the FBI's new serial killer unit, which formed the basis of the Netflix series Mindhunter. He might have been a monster to the public, but for cops and criminologists and the media, he was an endless source of information. One time, when being interviewed back in the day by the FBI's famed mindhunter Robert Ressler, Ressler got anxious and pushed the button for the guard to come. Ed looked at him and said, "I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." By the time the guard arrived, Ed had said he was just kidding. Ressler later recounted, "My mind raced. I envisioned him reaching for me with his large arms, pinning me to a wall in a stranglehold and then jerking my head around until my neck was broken. It wouldn't take long." Ed asked for the death penalty and to be executed prior to torture, but he didn't get his wish. He was imprisoned and later on a few occasions denied parole. He once said, "Society's not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." The last time he was denied parole was in 2017, and he won't get his next hearing until 2024. He'll be 76 years old. He's always been considered a model prisoner, but it's likely even as he approaches the twilight of his life, he'll remain behind bars. Can you be born evil? That was the question the British public asked as 11-year-old Mary Bell stood in court in Newcastle, England in 1968. Everything about Mary seemed completely typical of a girl her age, except for the fact that she had murdered 2 people. The country had never seen anything quite like it. This pretty young girl was called a bad seed like no other, a vicious psychopath, a calculating and cruel beast. Yet on the outside, she was sweet and innocent. The question then on everyone's mind was, can psychopaths be cured? Can heartless killers of children ever be trusted when they become adults? That's something you can tell us once you've heard all the details. Mary Bell was born on May 26, 1957. She grew up about 3 miles outside the city of Newcastle in the suburb of Scotswood. This was a rough and tumble area where many of the men worked in coal mines and factories, where unemployment and violent crime and alcoholism were rife, where day-to-day living was as hard as it got in Great Britain. Young kids spent much of their time in the streets, playing among the bricks and stones and broken glass of boarded-up, derelict houses. This is where Mary and her friend and neighbor, Norma, also named Belle but not related, changed the face of British crime in the summer of 1968. For many in Great Britain, this was another so-called summer of love, but the streets of Scotswood were a far cry from the colorful TV images Americans saw of Britain in the swinging 60s. Scotswood wasn't swinging. It was sinking into a mire of abject poverty and urban decay, where working-class kids ran around with filthy faces and mischief on their minds. 4-year-old Martin Brown was one of them. He lived around the corner from White House Road at 140 Margaret's Road. Martin's family was impoverished, but his parents, June and Georgie, kept their house neat and tidy. They spoiled Martin, giving him as much as a child could expect living in such urban squalor. Still, compared to 2024, kids like Martin were given almost no parental guidance. They were products of the street no sooner than they hit 3. On May 25th, Martin woke up early. It was a Sunday, and June and Georgie liked to stay in bed late on the weekends. Martin got up at 6:30 a.m. and went to the room where his 1-year-old sister Linda was sleeping on her cot. As usual, he got some bread and milk and fed Linda, being careful not to wake his parents. When June and Georgie got out of bed around 9, Martin had already dressed Linda. He told his parents he was going to go out to play. Little did they know, he would never return. 2 men working in one of the houses being demolished saw Martin a bit later walking in the streets, his blue coat fastened up for what looked like another rainy day. Martin's Aunt Rita saw him at about 11 a.m. when he visited her house further down St. Margaret's Road. As usual, he'd walked in through the open door. Rita woke up in a fright. Martin was standing right over her. She wasn't happy about being woken up, not on the day she usually slept late, and she shouted at him to get out. Rita's mom, who was downstairs, took pity on Martin and cooked him an egg on toast. He was still teary-eyed when Rita finally got up and came downstairs. He didn't like being shouted at, not by Rita, who he dearly loved. She apologized and all was good when he left her house a few minutes later. That same morning, Mary Bell, 10, and Norma Bell, 13, made an appearance at Rita's house. Rita adored Norma because she often came around and took her 3-year-old son John off her hands, taking him out to play in the streets. But Rita didn't much like Mary, a sneaky girl who often had an air of mischief about her. Rita shouldn't have allowed those girls anywhere near her son. Martin was out of the house for hours. At around 3 p.m., he was seen with other little boys in Mr. Dixon's shop, where the lads often went to buy candy. Mr. Dixon remembered shouting at Martin that day. Martin's hands were filthy from playing in the abandoned houses, yet he had them in his mouth. After Dixon admonished him, Martin bought a lollipop from the sweet tray. Martin went back round to Rita's house. He was now completely covered in dirt, so she told him to get a wash. He asked if he could have his dinner at her house later in the day. For now, he had a slice of bread with margarine, not butter, since Rita was saving the butter for Sunday tea. Martin was upset about this. He hated margarine. He turned to her and shouted, "I'm not coming to your house no bloody more," and he stormed out in a huff. At around 3:30 p.m., workers in another of the condemned houses on the street saw Martin again. Across the street, 3 boys aged 16, 14, and 8 were collecting scrap wood from the partly demolished houses so they could build a pigeon coop. One of the boys suddenly let out a scream loud enough for the workmen to hear. They walked into the house where one of the boys, his face ashen white, told them to go into one of the bedrooms upstairs. The workmen found a boarded-up window. Below it was a bit of gravel, and on the gravel was the body of a young boy. It was Martin. His arms were stretched to his side. Blood and saliva dripped from his mouth. One of the workmen, John Hall, later said, "We knew him right away. They'd given Martin some cookies earlier in the day. The men called an ambulance." John later testified, "I gave the boy the kiss of life. I just held him in my arms all the time. He looked dead to me. His body was cold." The 2 older teenage boys, Walter and Fred, felt like they would pass out. They went to another room to calm down, and that's when they looked out of the window and saw 2 girls with dark hair walking down the street. The 2 girls stopped at the window where the boys were standing. Walter knew one of them. Her name was Mary Bell. Walter later testified that he met Mary and Norma on the stairs, and he told them she couldn't come any further because there was something awful in the house. Mary said she already knew, but he wouldn't let her pass. Mary and Norma then walked over to Rita's house. Rita was cooking sausages and had just put curlers in her hair when Mary said that she'd better come outside. Mary told her, "One of your sister's kids has just had an accident. We think it's Martin, but we can't tell because there's blood all over him." This was a slight exaggeration, but the girls were more than happy to ignite Rita's distress. Rita, hysterical, left the sausages in the pan and ran to the house with Mary. Rita pushed Mary out of the way. Martin was lying on the floor. A man was above him, still trying to resuscitate him. Rita cried out, "He's asleep, that's all. He'll wake up in a second." By this time, someone had already run to Martin's house and told June and Georgie. When June turned up at the condemned house, Rita was still hysterical, still saying Martin was asleep and would wake up. June later testified, "I knew he was dead." The question was, what had happened? How had her son had an accident in an empty bedroom? If he'd hit his head, how? Had he run across the room and slipped? It didn't seem likely. There was a hole in the ceiling, but it was on the other side of the room from where Martin's body had been found. It was unlikely anything had fallen on him, so how does a boy just die like that? This would become a mystery with a dark and fascinating twist only emerging decades later. Later that night, pathologist Dr. Bernhard Knight said he couldn't determine the cause of death. He said that Martin had been in very good health. There were no injuries on his body except a small bruise on his knee. A young, healthy boy had seemingly passed out and died for no reason. Knight said it could have possibly been poison. In the house, empty bottles had been found. Maybe Martin had drunk from one of the bottles and it had contained some kind of noxious cleaning agent, but the autopsy suggested this was not the case. There was, of course, asphyxiation. Had Martin been strangled by someone? But if he had, he'd surely had no bruises on his neck. And Dr. Knight couldn't find any sign that someone had applied force to Martin's neck. His death was ruled an accident, which meant that detectives from the CID didn't join the investigation. And that was it. June and Georgie had to live with the fact that their son had somehow just passed out and died for no good reason. The next day, Sunday, Norma and Mary visited Rita again. Rita was still shaken up, so the girls said they'd take her son John off her hands for a while. At first, Rita thought how very kind this was of them. She often struggled on Sundays with her 4 children when there was a lot of cooking to do. Sundays were always busy, not least because this was the day all the family took their weekly bath, usually sharing the same water to save electricity. Mary and Norma showed up at Rita's every day after that, taking little John into the streets. But something started to bother Rita. Mary kept asking her, "Do you miss Martin? Do you cry for him?" Rita found it strange when they smiled one time and asked, "Does June miss Martin?" The girls were grinning from ear to ear. Rita later said, "I could stand it no more and I told them to get out and not come back." For the life of her, she had no idea why they'd mess with her emotions like that. We now know Rita had underestimated the parameters of the expression "children can be cruel." It had been Mary's 11th birthday on May 26, the day after Martin's death. That day, she'd taken her Alsatian dog out to the park. All the kids were scared of the dog, especially Susan, Norma's 11-year-old sister. Mary and Susan were alone in the park when Mary asked Susan, "Where's my birthday card?" Susan said, "I don't know, but I definitely sent you one." Mary called her a liar. She flew at Susan in a rage, clasping her hands around her neck. Susan could barely breathe but managed to wriggle herself free. She ran, after which Mary told her Alsatian to get her. Susan had never been so scared her whole life. When she got to her house door, her mom heard her screams. She opened the door to see Mary with her hands around her daughter's neck. She hit Mary's hands away and shouted at her, "What's wrong with that girl?" The next day, Monday the 27th, teachers at the local nursery turned up to the school and discovered that someone had broken into the classrooms. Vandals had gotten in through the roof. They'd kicked a few things around and sprayed chemical agents on the floor. Books had been ripped up. The chairs and the desks had all been kicked over. Curiously, the police found pieces of paper on the floor with childish writing scrawled on them, writing that seemed to confess to a certain little boy's murder. It was hard to tell if the message was purposefully cryptic or merely the scribblings of a barely literate child who'd perhaps grown up with foul-mouthed adults. The cops thought the notes were just a prank by the local kids. They stored the pieces of paper at the station and helped the nursery install an alarm system. That same day in school, the kids in Mary's class, 40 in total, were asked to write about their weekend in the newsbook. Mary drew a picture of a dead child and wrote about Martin's death and the fact that she'd been nearby at the time. She was the only student in the class to mention it. Mary had been acting strange in class for some time now. She would sometimes violently shake her head from side to side for no good reason. She'd just stare at another student with what could only be described as rage written on her face, and then she would attack the student. The teachers always knew when an attack was imminent. These teachers might have well assumed that Mary was traumatized by Martin's death. That's partly what Martin's mom June thought. When 4 days after Martin had died, Mary turned up at her house and, after knocking on the door, said, "I want to see Martin." "Martin's dead," said June, suppressing the urge to cry. "I know," said Mary. "I just want to see him in his coffin." Mary wasn't traumatized, June noticed. She was grinning. June slammed the door in her face. What an absolutely wretched little girl, she thought. Rumors were already circulating about Mary and Norma being kids with a nasty streak. Earlier that same month, before Martin's death, 3-year-old John, Rita's son, had been found wandering around St. Margaret's Road with blood dripping down his face from a cut on his head. John had later told the police that he'd been with Mary and Norma, playing on a disused air raid shelter when the girls pushed him off. Police measured the drop at about 7 feet. It could have killed him, but it wasn't clear if John had just fallen and was confused about being pushed. That same evening, 3 local girls said they were out playing in the sandpit when Mary and Norma got hold of them. They said the girls put their hands around their necks and tried to strangle them. Police then went to see Mary and Norma. In the statement Mary gave about John, she said, "We went through the grass and through the fence and found John staggering around behind the sheds. He had bleeding from his head and had been sick all over his coat. She said that she didn't know he'd hurt himself. Norma's statement was similar. As for the girls, Cindy, Pauline, Wendy, and Susan, all age either 6 or 7, they said Mary had attacked them. Pauline told the police, "The girl took her hands off my neck, and she did the same to Susan. Me, Cindy, and Susan all ran home. The girl who squeezed my neck had short dark hair. I don't know this girl and had not seen her before." In Mary's statement, she denied any wrongdoing. In fact, she kind of blamed Norma. Her statement read, "When I was behind the shed, I heard Pauline scream. I came from behind the shed and I saw Pauline running away toward the fence. She was holding her throat and screaming. I asked Norma what had happened and she said that Pauline had fallen and hurt her throat on the edge of the sandpit." Norma's statement was more revealing. She told the cops. Then Mary went to the other girl and said, "What happens if you choke someone? Do they die?" Then Mary put both hands around the girl's throat and squeezed. The girl started to go purple. I told Mary to stop, but she wouldn't. She did this for a while and then she put her hands around Pauline's throat and she started going purple as well. Both Pauline and the other girl were crying. Another girl, Susan Cornish, came up and Mary did the same to her. We guess Mary and Norma were not adherents to the expression, "snitches get stitches," because they remained good friends after that. The police were somewhat taken aback. If this was true, a cute little girl had seemingly tried to throttle to death a bunch of other little girls. Even in the darkest depths of Newcastle, then with some of the highest rates of violence in England, that was highly unusual. The police wrote a caution which said these girls' bell have been warned as to their future conduct. On May 31st, the police at the local station were called to the nursery again. The alarm that they'd helped install had just gone off. When they were there, 2 girls were in the yard, Mary and Norma Bell. Both were charged with breaking and entering, a case that would go to the juvenile court in a few months. These girls were now becoming quite problematic. The cops wanted to speak to Mary's mom and dad. Strange people we'll discuss in detail later. The father, Billy, said that he'd keep a tight leash on Mary, but he didn't. As for the mother, Betty, as usual, she wasn't around. This incredibly peculiar woman lived a life of mystery, something that would take many years to unravel. About a week later, a 12-year-old boy was in the nursery sandpit when he saw Mary and Norma playing. He later told his parents that Norma was running when Mary tripped her up. She then sat on Norma's chest and started scratching her face. "I'm a murderer," Mary screamed with a look of glee and madness etched into her features. The boy thought this was funny, until Mary stood up, pulled back Norma's head by her hair, and kicked her hard right in the eye. Mary, who you know had just turned 11, was much smaller than Norma, but she was definitely the toughest of the two. The boy, now freaked out, looked Mary in the eye. With a nasty expression on her face, she pointed at the derelict house where Martin had been found and told him, "That's where I did it. That's where I killed Brown." The boy smiled nervously, urine almost breaching the walls of his bladder, and he ran away. Martin's death was an accident. That's what everyone thought. They were annoyed at the state of the streets, at all the broken houses, the vermin, the industrial mess that they called home. Parents marched protesting about the dangers of the condemned houses. Mary walked down the street holding a banner that said, "Tenants want action, not excuses." Under no circumstances, despite her dalliances with extreme violence, did anyone for a second think Mary and Norma might have been behind Martin's early demise. There was, however, a lot of anger aimed at the government from a people who seemed to be constantly at war with pitifully low wages and horrid living conditions. Their focus was not on Mary and her friend at this point. The Howe family knew all about crappy living conditions. They had 5 kids to feed. The father worked long hours, and the mother, after living in the damp house and subsisting on bread and butter, spent much of her life sick in the hospital. Like many local women, she was overworked and nutritionally deficient, just as many of the kids were. It was fortunate for Mr. Howe that he had his 14-year-old daughter, Pat, whose role had morphed into being the mother of the younger kids, while the real mom was in the hospital. That same summer, Pat was running around cooking and cleaning when Mary showed up at the house. The younger kids were home, as was Pat's brother and his girlfriend, Irene. Mary went to the living room and told Irene she had a secret. "Okay, go on then, tell me everything," Irene said, thinking Mary was about to tell her one of her tall tales. Mary said it was about Martin's death. "Norma put her hands on his throat," Mary said, explaining that Norma squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until the life force inside little Martin left him. In such a small community, word traveled fast. All the neighbors were soon saying that little Mary Bell was telling tales about her best friend Norma Bell. How could she say such things? No one believed Mary, of course. Little girls don't murder people. Mary got a telling off for spreading lies. She was soon around at Norma Bell's house apologizing to Norma's parents for making up such sick stories. Brian Howe, Pat's younger brother, was 3 years and 4 months old. Small in frame with a pinkish complexion, he was the proverbial bundle of joy. He liked to play a lot with Rita's son John, and that meant that Brian often came into contact with Mary and Norma. They often took John off Rita's hands and they took Brian off Pat's hands, so they were well-liked kids by the adults, despite being mischievous at times. Rita loved Pat, who was 14 going on 40, a responsible young woman who'd given up school to help her dad. Some days Pat would go around to Rita's and take John and Brian to the nursery, and sometimes Rita would take them. On July 31st, it was Rita's turn to take the kids, but when she went round to Pat's house, no one answered the door. She walked John to the nursery and Brian wasn't there either. She figured Pat must have slept in. She was right. Later that day, about 1:30 p.m., Rita went to pick up John and she found John and Brian together watching some demolition men pull down one of the houses. She shouted at the workmen, telling them the bricks could have hit the kids. They shouldn't have allowed them so close. Rita later said, "I went mad. I screamed at the men and said they didn't know better. A brick could fall down and kill them. How could they let them sit there?" Once Rita calmed down, she put John to bed early without any supper and stuffed some cookies into Brian's pants pockets. She told him that he should explain to Pat. After all, Martin had died in one of those houses. He might have only been 3, but he should have known better than to hang around next to those dangerous, dilapidated places. Rita didn't see Brian again, not that day, not ever. At about 2 o'clock, he was seen with his pet dog Lassie, playing with some girls who were riding bicycles. A little later, Mary and Norma knocked on Rita's house door. "Where's my boyfriend?" Mary joked, meaning John. Rita explained that he wouldn't be playing out today. He'd been sent to bed early for playing in one of the houses. It was a beautiful day and still very early. Rita later admitted, "I almost got John up and let him go out to play with the girls." She would be eternally glad that she hadn't. Pat got home at about 3:30 p.m. and asked where Brian was. Irene was home and told her that he'd gone out to play. At about 4, Pat's father told her to go find Brian and bring him home for tea. Pat went out, first stopping at Maxime's house. Maxime was Norma Bell's neighbor. Norma was there, as was Mary. After Pat asked them if they'd seen Brian, Mary asked if she could help her look for him. Norma got on her bicycle and said she'd also join the search party, but Norma later went off by herself. What Norma and Mary did that afternoon would become the utmost importance in the near future. After asking some boys if they'd seen Brian, Mary beckoned Pat to go to a place where all the kids often hung out, outside a shop named Davies. There weren't many places for kids to do things in Scottswood. Davies was one of the regular haunts, as was a car park near the railway lines. Brian wasn't at any of these places, which only left the wasteland known as the Tin Lizzie. This was a stretch of land filled with junk, car parts, bricks, tires, rusty oil drums, smashed doors, and shards of broken glass. It was a dump, but for working-class kids it was an industrial adventure playground. They loved it there, despite the many cuts and bruises they incurred. Mary said to Pat, "Maybe he's over there," and she pointed at some big concrete blocks, building materials that had been dumped so long ago grass and weeds had grown all around them. Pat told Mary that Brian wouldn't go down there. It was too dangerous, and Brian knew better. Mary said, "Okay, let's go to the next place." The hours passed and still there was no sign of Brian. Close to 7 p.m., Pat told Mary she was going to call the police. They looked everywhere. Pat's boyfriend by this time had also joined the search. Norma went off with a girl named Linda and said that she wouldn't join the search again this evening. She didn't seem concerned at all that Brian was missing. Pat was appreciative of Mary, who kept looking. But then at 7:30, Billy, Mary's father, called Mary in for supper. Mary was in bed when Brian was found. At precisely 11:10 p.m. that same night, he was exactly where Mary had asked Pat to look, in between huge concrete blocks on the Tin Lizzie. He was lying motionless in a mass of weeds, one of his arms pointing away from him, his hand black with dirt. At his side was a pair of scissors. One of the blades was bent and the other had snapped off. His lips were blue. There was blood-colored saliva all around his mouth, and there were some scratches around his face. This time, it seemed obvious that someone had had their hands around his neck. You could see the bruising. He was dead. He obviously had been dead for quite a few hours. The whole town had been looking for him, but not Mary's mom and dad. Rita and Martin's mom, June, had led the search with Pat, making sure to keep everyone in cups of tea and Spam sandwiches. After stopping for a break, they'd gone out again, and it was on this second run that Brian's body was found. At about 11:30, Mary woke up to the sound of police car sirens. She went downstairs and asked her dad what was going on. "They found Brian Howe," he said. "His body was found at the Tin Lizzie," he told Mary. "Oh," is all Mary said. She then went back to bed as if nothing had happened. At about 1 a.m., Chief Inspector James Dobson of the CID was awoken from his sleep. Such late-night calls usually meant one thing: death or destruction. He was informed that a young lad named Brian Howe had been stabbed. Dobson got out of bed and drove to what was now almost certainly a murder scene. This was strange, 2 dead kids in Scotswood in a matter of months. He thought about Martin, the young boy whose death he'd not been able to get off his mind. He never felt comfortable calling that one an accident, and now there was another dead kid almost exactly the same age. Something wasn't right here. The pathologist confirmed the boy had been dead for a few hours. There were scratches on his face and around his neck. Marks on his nostrils seemed to suggest someone had pinched them. He also had scratches around his scrotum, which could suggest a possible sexual element to the crime. He'd been stabbed 6 times in total. The puncture wounds were on his calves, legs, and back. It looked as if he'd suffered a prolonged torture. The pathologist, Dr. Bernhard Tomlinson, said the cause of death was likely strangulation, but whoever had done it hadn't applied much pressure. So he said he doubted the killer was an adult. He also said the other injuries, the scratches and the puncture wounds, weren't very serious. It was as if someone had practiced stabbing him, not shoving the blade in very far. They were the kinds of wounds a child might inflict on another child, said Tomlinson. He reckoned the time of death was anywhere between 3:30 and 4:30, but he couldn't be sure. This was after he'd been seen playing with the girls and long after Rita had smacked him and packed him off with biscuits. They sent the body to Newcastle General Hospital for further tests. Brian's stepbrother Albert Howe was the one who had to identify the body. He was crying already when he met with the Dobson at the hospital and almost collapsed in tears when he saw the body. Detective Dobson later said that they set up a murder room and police worked through the night. Detectives from all over the region helped. They worked night and day, sleeping at the station for 8 days. After all, this was a child murder, enough to send the public over the edge. They visited 1,200 houses in Scotswood and talked to every child in every house. One of those kids must have seen something. The kids still played outside, but now they hung out in groups. Fear pervaded the town. Who's next? People wondered. After the preliminary interviews, the detectives looked at the statements that stood out. Norma Bell's name came up. The policeman who'd talked to her had written down, "I thought Norma was peculiar. She was continually smiling as if it was a huge joke." Her mother kept saying, "Didn't you hear what he asked? Answer the question." In her final statement, Norma had said, "The last time I saw Brian Howe was about 12:45 p.m. Wednesday the 31st of July, 1968, when he was playing with his brother and 2 little girls on the corner of White House Road and Cross Hill Road. I cannot say who the little girls were." Norma said she then went to make pom-poms with 2 other girls. The police interviewer had written "verified" next to the pom-pom part. That could have meant that when Brian was murdered, Norma had an alibi, but she was certainly one of the last people to see him that day. That same cop then went next door to speak to Mary Bell. He said in that house something just didn't feel right. He wrote in his report, "No feeling of a home, just a shell, very peculiar. The only life one felt was that big dog barking." Mary was the most evasive child I'd ever come across. He didn't know it then, but he'd been talking with a very special case, a girl who knew how to manipulate adults. He also wrote, "And her father was very odd. I asked him, 'You be her father?' And he said, 'No, I am her uncle.' 'Where are her parents?' I asked, and he answered, 'She's only got a mother and she's away on business.' All the questions I had asked her, she was continually looking at him for guidance." In Mary's statement, she said, "I last saw Brian Howe in White House Road about 12:30 p.m. Wednesday, the 31st of July, 1968, when he was playing with his brother. I did not go near railway lines or the waste ground near there at all on Wednesday, the 31st, July, 1978. I've been down there before, but it was at least 2 months ago." There was no way to verify this as of yet. The constable doing the interviews had that sixth sense cops often get. Something just didn't feel right about these girls. So he went back to see Norma, and she added a little extra to her statement. She said, "About 3:15 p.m. that day, I went out the back way and met Mary. We crossed our back garden, went up the garden path, and into White House Road, and we just played in the street until about 5 p.m. As far as I know, Mary just went into her house. I didn't see her again until 7 p.m. in the back lane behind our house when she was on her own." So what had Mary been doing until 7 p.m.? The next day, August 2nd, Detective Sergeant Doherty went to see Mary, having found inconsistencies in her answers. Mary added now quite a lot to her story. She said actually she had seen someone with Brian. She said it was a boy whose name she didn't know. She said the boy had hit Brian in the face. She explained this kid had pulled out some broken scissors and stuck Brian with them. For good measure, she added, "And I saw him trying to cut a cat's tail off with those scissors." What was extremely revealing for the police was the scissors found next to Brian's body had not been in any of the news reports and not in any of the photographs, so either Mary was telling the truth about a delinquent feline-hating psycho boy whom she said was probably 8, or she herself had used those scissors. It was obvious that she knew something very important. And Norma was by no means out of the woods. Several kids and other witnesses had said that they had saw Mary and Norma together with that horrible ferocious Alsatian, and this was at a time when Norma had claimed to have not been with Mary. The police went to see Mary again. This time she was the only one in the house. Her supposed uncle, she said, was at the pub, and her mom, well, she had no idea where her mom was. The cops felt this was strange. This wasn't your normal household. They went next door, and this time Norma looked pale. She was shaking, especially when Chief Inspector Dobson had told her, anything you say may be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence. Dobson, who'd been informed that she wanted to talk to the police again, having already seen that she'd made a few contradictory statements, said to her, I understand that you have something you want to tell me about the death of Brian Howe. She did. She had a lot to tell him. She said the day before Brian died, she and Mary had gone down to the Tin Lizzie to play. She explained, when I went into the blocks, I tripped over something. I looked down and I saw it was Brian's head. He was covered in grass, but I could see all of his face. He was dead. She added, his lips were purple. Mary ran her fingers along his lips. She said that she had enjoyed it. Norma explained how Mary had told her that she'd held his nose and lips and watched him die, and that she'd taken pleasure in this. Norma further explained, Mary showed me a razor and she said she'd cut his belly. She pulled his jersey up and showed me the tiny cut on his belly. She hid the razor under a block and told me not to tell my dad or she would get in trouble. The police took her back to the site where Brian had been killed, and sure enough, there was a razor where Norma said Mary had hidden one. The cops got her to lie down in the position that Brian had died in, and she did it exactly how Brian had been found. She later gave a full statement with her dad at her side at the police station. It was shocking. Mary, according to Norma, was obsessed with death. At the end of the statement, Norma added a bit extra, saying, when we were looking at Brian on Wednesday, Mary said she was not frightened of dead bodies because she had seen a few. I didn't tell anybody about it because I was frightened, and if I had snitched, Mary could have taken anyone else's child. The police went to Mary's house that same night. Billy was drunk again watching TV. He barely even looked the police in the face when he told them Mary was sleeping, and if they wanted to go talk to her, they damn well better go get her themselves and dress her, because he wasn't going to do it. And no, he said, her mom isn't here. He was still claiming to be her uncle at this point. The police took Mary to the station. Billy didn't bother going, so a woman, a so-called responsible adult, took care of Mary. After a series of questions, Dobson said, I have reason to believe that when you were in the blocks with Norma, you showed her something, which you said you had done something to Brian with. I never, screamed Mary, pausing and then saying, I'll kill her. This was perhaps not the best reaction, considering what the interview was all about. It's always me you come for, she whined. Norma's a liar. She always tries to get me into trouble. She kept this up for hours on end, which was indeed impressive for such a young girl. She was also very smart and used words that children didn't usually use. At one point, she told the shocked detective, You're trying to brainwash me. I will get a solicitor to get me out of this. The police had to let her go. Norma then made another statement, adding more to the story about what they had done to Brian's body. Even so, the detective still didn't have enough to charge Mary. Then the day came of Brian's funeral. His casket was taken down the street with all the neighbors out watching. Mary was there, as was Detective Dobson, who didn't take his eyes off her. He later said Mary Bell was standing in front of the house when the coffin was brought out. She stood there laughing and rubbing her hands. I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one. Mary then made another statement. This one was rather more telling. She explained that she and Norma had taken Brian out that day and they'd all ended up at the wasteland. It was there, she said, that this happened. Norma started to feel up and down his neck. She squeezed it hard. You could tell it was hard because her fingertips were going white. Brian was struggling and I was pulling her shoulders, but she went mad. And I was pulling her chin up, but she screamed at me. By this time, she had banged Brian's head on some wood or corner of wood, and Brian was lying senseless. Mary said Norma had told her, this is the first, but it'll not be the last. Norma and she then went back to the street where they got hold of some scissors, and then they returned to the body, and Norma, not Mary, started cutting Brian. She told Dobson, I had done nothing. I haven't got the guts. I couldn't kill a bird by the neck or throat or anything. It's horrible that. Funnily enough, in a few years' time, Mary would have had a very sickening bird story told about her. and she'd have a run-in with some hamsters, but let's stay in the present for now. She said Norma had wanted them both to run away, or get taken away to a children's home, which was strange to Dobson given it was Mary's household that was starved of love, not Norma's. The woman who'd been there as a responsible adult for Mary couldn't believe what she'd seen. She told Dobson she felt nothing. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, telling him Mary spoke like an adult, using adult vocabulary, and that it all seemed like a game to her. She, of course, wondered what the hell this girl had experienced at home to turn out this way. At the time, Mary's mom, Betty, was still away in Glasgow, so it was hard to get a read on Mary's home life. It was obvious her uncle, Billy, didn't care much at all. Later that night, Mary was brought in and charged with Brian's murder. She looked at Dobson and smiled and said, "That's all right with me." Norma was also arrested. After being charged, she said, I'll pay you back for this." She was crying like a little girl. She cried all night. Mary barely even looked rattled. In fact, when two policewomen visited the girls later, who were now in adjoining cells, Mary seemed excited. She told the women that Mr. Dobson had been so kind to buy them fish and chips. She was most concerned about having holes in her shoes for her court date. She told one of the women, "What will the people think if they see me like this?" This was strange for a little girl, but stranger was the fact that Mary didn't sleep at all that night. She sat up singing a song. Mary was indeed like no other child the authorities had ever seen. She had no remorse for what she had done. She seemed to think it was amusing. What each girl had done was still unclear, but it was certain that they'd committed a terrible act. That part of the investigation was ongoing. Of course, psychiatrists came and spoke to them. Norma was like any other kid, but Mary was an anomaly of a child. She was bright, devious, and calculating, sometimes seemingly endowed with the mind of someone many years older. Yet Norma was below average intelligence. "I've seen a lot of psychopathic children," Dr. Orton, who saw Mary several times, said later, "but I've never met one like Mary, as intelligent, as manipulative, or as dangerous. I knew a lot about her family, about her mother, from the probation people." So what about Mary's mysterious mother, who didn't even bother to turn up at the police station at this point? It turned out that she was a sex worker who specialized as a dominatrix, which is why she spent a lot of time in Glasgow. Whether Billy was Mary's father or not was a mystery and would remain a mystery. Likely he wasn't. He certainly didn't give much of a damn about Mary. Mary's life was a living hell, it turned out. But this wasn't the end of the story, and Mary, traumatized or not, was still a killer. She was a very calculating and cruel girl. There were still many more lies and scandals down the road for her. The trial exposed that the handwriting on those notes left at the school after Martin had died matched with Mary's. The evidence pointed toward Mary being the killer, the disturbed party, and Norma being under her wicked spell. It was argued that Mary had been the dominant party in these crimes, but in her defense, it was also argued that such a terrible upbringing had disturbed the development of her mind. At this moment in time, with no books yet written about Mary, very little was actually known about her terrible upbringing. Her mom, now in court, Billy, and all their relatives didn't breathe a word about the worst of it. Sure, she was very smart, but she didn't seem to know what was right and what was wrong. Was she also a victim? The British media didn't see it that way, calling the girls monsters who deserved to remain in prison for the rest of their lives. Some of the headlines included the words bad seeds, evil birth, and child monster. So would Mary be found guilty? The question hung largely on just who and what Mary Bell was. Was she really the cold-hearted psycho child the press said she was? Or was she a victim of a horrific upbringing in which she'd created a fantasy world to escape reality? Dr. David Westbury, a home office psychiatrist, had said during the trial that Mary had a psychopathic disorder. The trial also exposed just how rotten so many poor kids had it in Northern England. But then again, poor kids usually didn't murder for fun. Mary did have people who loved her grandmother and her aunts, Kath, Isa, and Audrey. Her uncles, Philip and Jack, were all described as intelligent, hardworking, and good people in the book we mentioned. Even so, they all had a secret that compelled Aunt Audrey to tell the author of that book that they were all to blame for what happened to Mary. They'd all hidden the ugly truth at the time of the trial. Mary's mom, Betty, had grown up in Glasgow, desperately poor. She worked in a rope factory as a child and became pregnant while still a teenager. Her first words when Mary was born were, "Take this thing away from me." Nurses tried to put Mary in her arms, and Betty looked repulsed, turning her face away, refusing to touch Mary. "We couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe it," said one of Mary's aunts. When Mary was a child, one of those aunts was called to the hospital. Poor Mary was having her stomach pumped again. When the aunt arrived, Betty, looking angry, told her, "Don't believe her," meaning Mary. She says, "I gave her those pills." Had Betty tried to overdose her own daughter and kill her? Had she tried this before? When the doctors asked Mary what had happened, she told him, "Me ma'am gave me the Smarties." A week later, the aunt talked with Mary's best friend, a 5-year-old. The girl told the aunt Mary's ma'am gave her the Smarties in the backyard. She said she saw it with her own eyes. That same girl a while later was playing out with Mary when she was hit by a bus and killed. All Mary knew was trauma. Her entire young life was a story of trauma. Was it a coincidence then, when Martin Brown died that day, that Mary kept talking about the time that her mom gave her those pills? Martin's cause of death was never confirmed, but pills were certainly not out of the question. Had Mary done to Martin what her mom had done to her? This was one of those dark secrets that the family kept from the courts. Was Betty trying to kill her own daughter? Or, goes another theory, did she have Munchausen's by proxy? And did she prescribe pills to Mary that Mary didn't need? On December 17, 1968, after over 3 hours of deliberation by the jury, the court clerk asked, "Members of the jury, are you all agreed upon your verdict?" "We are," came the response. Norma Bell, of the murder of Martin Brown, not guilty, they said. Of the manslaughter of Martin Brown, also not guilty. Norma clapped and smiled. Her dad put his hand on her head and gently turned her toward the judge, where she should still be looking. "Do you find Mary Flora Bell guilty or not guilty of the murder of Martin Brown?" asked the clerk, to which the jury foreman replied, "Guilty of manslaughter." And through loud sobs of Mary, he said, "Because of diminished responsibility." She was found not guilty of the murder of both the boys, but guilty of manslaughter. Mary cried for joy. Billy and Betty were there. Betty looked slightly relieved. Billy sat with his head in his hands. None of them said anything to Mary or even hugged her. They barely even looked her way. The entire courtroom understood only too well that this girl was on her own. She'd always been on her own, but that didn't mean that she wasn't a very sick child. The only person to speak to Mary right after the verdict was her solicitor, David Bryson, who whispered something in her ear. During the sentencing, Mr. Justice Cusack described Mary, Britain's youngest killer, as a dangerous individual. He said she posed a very grave risk to other children, and for that reason needed to be taken out of society indefinitely. He explained to the court, "It means that the position can be considered from time to time, and if it becomes safe to release that person can be released. If the state saw fit, she would stay in prison forever." While locked up, Mary saw a slew of psychiatrists who usually said that she was a psychopath. There's a theory that one of the causes of psychopathy could be when young children become so badly traumatized that somehow their brains turn off emotions to protect them. Nonetheless, she certainly felt enough to tell the authorities at one point that she never wanted to see her mom again. She did see Billy. She actually visited him in prison when he was then serving time for armed robbery. She wept after telling one of the people in her unit, "I saw my dad in that place. It isn't a nice place at all." Was this highly intelligent girl a psychopath? She was certainly very sick. Officials where she was housed later said they'd given Mary hamsters to look after, and at some point, they were all found dead. Their necks had been wrung by human hands. One of her teachers was quick to defend her, saying, "But she has a budgerigar. She hasn't killed that, has she?" That was hardly the best defense. She remained manipulative, stating on some occasions that men at the special unit where she was kept had been the perpetrators of sexual misconduct. But it seems the evidence didn't hold up. She made a few such accusations, but in a trial in court, it was proven that she had lied in what looked like a deviant fantasy to all those watching. Her testimony showed glaring inconsistencies. It was obvious the lurid accusations were false. The prosecution had to withdraw the case, after which Judge William Openshaw directed the jury to find the defendant not guilty. "She has told 4 stories, the judge told the court, and having told 4 stories, it is inconceivable that the jury would believe any one of them. She has fabricated. She is a very sick child. One can only hope that she can be given treatment to help here." Could such a sick child ever live a normal life outside of special units and prisons? Would Mary ever be free of the psychopathy that caused so much damage to people who came into contact with her? Could someone so unloved ever love someone else? In 1976, it looked like that was possible. Mary had been transferred to an open prison where she was studying a secretarial course. But later that year, with security lax, she tried to escape with another prisoner. They both stayed in hotels in the northern seaside town of Blackpool, where they played games in amusement arcades. Mary made up for a life without sex by sleeping with a strange man, an ex-con. In 1977, he sold his story to the press, telling the world, "There were no evil demons in her when we made love." Mary was by then 20. The man said they made love all night long. For Mary, it was the first time and she enjoyed getting her rocks off. But when this later came out, it appalled much of the British public. Mary and her accomplice, a sex worker from nearby Leeds, dyed their hair and wore disguises, but it didn't work. They were both arrested and sent back to prison, where Mary was handed another 28 days. In 1980, she got out. She was given a new name with which to start her new life. In 1984, she gave birth to a daughter, who would be her only child. The daughter had no idea who her mom really was until 1998, when news reporters discovered where she and Mary were living. The reporters got hold of Mary's lover, a man the Observer reported as a 40-year-old Geordie with a ponytail, tattoos, and a lived-in look. The article said he cried and drank whiskey and a beer as he poured his heart out. According to the article, Mary was the gentlest person he had ever met. He loved her so much it hurt to be parted. She had always wanted to work with children. Writer Gitta Sarani, who was criticized by some for bringing Mary's story back to life that year, also said Mary lived with a lot of guilt over what she had done in her childhood. In 2003, the Bells won a decision in court to keep their anonymity forever. According to Sarani, in later life, Mary hasn't tried to deny what happened, but she has attempted to address the reasons why she was the way she was. Mary didn't think she was a freak of nature, as the press often said, but a consequence of what can happen when seeds are planted into the most toxic of environments. When Mary turned 16 and was sent to a women's prison, she wrote to a friend saying, "The absolute enormity of my crime has suddenly dawned on me, that I have actually taken a life. I just cannot bear to hardly think of it." Within a period of 11 weeks in the year 1888, a series of brutal murders shocked London. You've heard the stories, you've seen the movies, but have you heard everything, uncensored, unembellished, the whole bloody tale? Today we'll do just that, providing details of the crimes you've never heard before. We're going to disclose some frankly disturbing things about day-to-day life in London's Victorian slums, and finish with our thoughts on who Jack the Ripper was. In the words of writer Philip K. Dick, all things are effed up. But after researching this show, we're going to say you couldn't get much more effed up than the streets of Whitechapel in the late 1800s. That's where we'll start, the streets. The incredibly mean streets. The British Empire in the late 19th century was going full steam ahead, having already expanded millions of square miles around the globe. Britain was an incredibly wealthy superpower. It was the global policeman. The sun didn't set on its empire, yet the money didn't always trickle down to the people often referred to as the irresponsible lower classes. Our story's mostly about those people. It takes place in Whitechapel, an area of East London renowned in Victorian times, 1831 to 1901, for its poverty-stricken streets, a collection of dingy and dangerous places off the main Whitechapel High Street. This Whitechapel slum, aka a rookery, was sometimes referred to as the Abyss. One writer explained that this is where the thief and the prostitute are harbored, among those whose only crime is poverty. The slums smelled awful. The writer George Gissing explained, "An evil smell hung about the butchers and fish shops. A public house poisoned a whole street with alcoholic fumes. From sewer grates rose a miasma that caught the breath. Rats scurried around underfoot. Disease was rife, cholera outbreaks were common. Tuberculosis thrived in the conditions where entire families were cramped in highly unsanitary one-room abodes. The lodging houses you'll hear about in detail today. Venereal disease flourished. There were outbreaks of smallpox and typhoid. People choked in the London fog, a thick pall of smoke from coal burning. Muggings and attacks on women were common, and the perpetrators, having the cover of smog, could often disappear into the dimly lit streets. In 1885, there were 13,319 police officers in London's Metropolitan Police for over 5 million Londoners. This included the variety of immigrants who made the city their home. Jews from Europe, Irish, Russian, German, French, Italian. The Met was split into 20 divisions. In 1878, Scotland Yard introduced the Criminal Investigation Department, or CID, plainclothes cops who at first investigated corrupt police, but then were tasked with investigating serious public crimes. In 1886, Charles Warren became the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, a man, as you'll see, who came undone at the hands of the Ripper. H Division of the Metropolitan Police was responsible for Whitechapel. On top of a superintendent and a chief inspector, there were 27 inspectors, 37 sergeants, and close to 500 constables, as well as 15 CID men. They policed about 176,000 people, with about one cop per every 300 people in the Whitechapel area. It's fair to say that they had their work cut out for them. The American author Jack London explained that it was hard to escape the sight of abject poverty. He said the streets thronged with people of wretched or beer-sodden appearance, where he witnessed long vistas of bricks and misery, and the air was obscene with the sounds of jangling and squabbling. Within all this squalor, there was a constant fear of violence, which was amplified by the rise of sensational news media and fictionalized in the popular penny dreadfuls, pulp publications describing murder and mayhem. In 1888, even the penny dreadfuls would look tame at the sight of Jack the Ripper's bloody depravity. Everything was about to change. In February of that year, 38-year-old Annie Millwood of Spitalfields was savagely attacked by a man wielding a clasp knife. An article in the Eastern Post explained, "It appears the deceased was admitted to the Whitechapel Infirmary, suffering from numerous stabs in the legs and lower part of the body. She made a full recovery and was sent to the South Grove Workhouse, but died in March from what coroner Winnie Edwin Baxter said was a sudden effusion into the pericardium from the rupture of the left pulmonary artery through ulceration. Her dying young was nothing out of the ordinary." Life expectancy for the whole of London during this period was about 37. The wealthy lived, on average, much longer than the poor. The life expectancy for an East End laborer was just 19. If we look at the age of deaths according to Whitechapel Registration District 1891, the highest death figures are of infants. The vast majority of people in Whitechapel died from the age of 15 to 35. Women lived longer than men, but not much more. Males tended to die more than women at laboring age 14 to 34. Annie Millwood had been a prostitute, as many poor women were in their continual efforts to obtain temporary lodgings for the night. That same March, the 29-year-old machinist Ada Wilson was attacked in her home. Ada was a dressmaker, but as her neighbors would later say, she had many male visitors come to her house in the dark hours. On the night of the 28th, a man arrived in her room on 9 Maidman Street, Mile End. She answered the door. A mustached man, about age 30, wearing a dark coat, demanded money. When she refused, he used a clasp knife to stab her in the throat. These stories might or might not directly relate to the murders of Jack the Ripper, but to understand him, we must understand where he preyed. We must also understand that serial killers often build up to their most gruesome acts, escalating their levels of violence. Less than a week after the attack on Annie, Emma Elizabeth Smith of Spitalfields was getting ready for work at her lodging house, applying her makeup and combing her hair. She was 45 and already a widow, not too attractive, known as one of the unfortunates. She was a prostitute who worked in the darkest corners of the darkest alleys for the lowest prices. The owner of her lodging house said that Emma would often come home with black eyes that men had given her. On one occasion, she returned home traumatized, explaining she had been thrown out of a window. The night of what would be a much more savage attack, she was seen with a man wearing dark clothing and a white neckerchief. The woman who saw her, fellow prostitute Margaret Hayes, said she had been punched in the mouth that night and so had decided to quit work early. Later, she met Emma, who said she had just been viciously attacked and robbed at what the papers called the dirty, narrow entrance to Brick Lane. Emma was in pain, serious pain, so Margaret took her to London Hospital, where Emma was seen by the house surgeon, Dr. George Haslip, a man who was used to seeing drunken prostitutes. But he was shocked at her injuries, which included a torn ear and damage to her peritoneum and other internal organs. She'd been savaged, outraged as the term was back then. She died 2 days later from peritonitis, the infection following a rupture of the abdomen. In the report written by Inspector Edmund Reed, he wrote, "She was in the habit of leaving about 6 or 7 p.m. and returning at all hours, usually drunk. She was aged 45 years, 5 foot 2 inches high, complexion fair, hair light brown, scar on right temple, no description of men." Emma had told Margaret that she thought she was attacked by 3 men, one as young as 19. Was this the work of one of the many gangs that roamed London at night, or was it part of a murderous conspiracy including the Ripper? Emma's death did not go unnoticed. The crime was shocking even for London's East End. Newspaper headlines included, "Horrible Murder in Whitechapel." On Saturday, the 14th of April, the Worcestershire Chronicle wrote, "Robbed, outraged, and wounded unto death, under circumstances of exceptional brutality, by a gang of ruffians while she was staggering home, the worse for drink." Describing Whitechapel for outsiders, the article said, "It seems scarcely possible to believe that a woman could fall to such depths of degradation, and yet she is no more than a typical example of those who patronize the foul haunts of these fearful houses, where drinking, fighting, and all other loathsome vices are the pastime of poor wretches who can't raise 2 shillings a week for the accommodation they get within their fetid walls." The coroner said it was impossible to imagine a more brutal and dastardly assault, but little did he know, worse was soon to come. Far, far worse. After the boozy bank holiday of August 6th, Martha Tabram was found dead in George Yard. off Whitechapel High Street at 4:45 a.m., now the 7th. Martha, abandoned by her father when she was a teenager, later had 2 children of her own, but the devil drink got its claws into her, and she was left by her husband. After finding out she was a prostitute, he reduced the 12 shillings maintenance allowance he paid her each week. Close to the time of her murder, she was living in lodging houses with William Turner. They tried to make ends meet by hawking trinkets in the streets, but it was never enough. As was common with poor couples, not just single women, she sold her body at night. William eventually left her, stating her alcoholism made their lives impossible. He explained, "Since she had been living with me, her character for sobriety was not good. If I gave her any money, she generally spent it on drink. In fact, it was always drink. Drink, hooch, sauce, firewater, whatever you like to call it, plays a major role in the story today, so we should just say a few things about it." After London's so-called gin craze in the mid-18th century, the British government tried to implement laws, the Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751, to cut down on alcohol abuse. In the 1730s, the average consumption of gin in London was 2 pints a week. That was the average. Some people did not drink any alcohol, so you can imagine how much those people who did drink consumed on a weekly basis. The government had some success, but in the 19th century, booze addiction became rife once more. It was at the center of much of the crime. As the Worcester Journal on Saturday the 14th of November 1891 explained, "There is no mistake about what is the cause of nearly all the crime on the East End of London. The curse of all is drink, and I must say that the wives are often worse than the husbands." Coroner Baxter, whom we mentioned earlier, told the Edinburgh Evening News on Thursday the 22nd of September 1892, "Generally speaking, the question of drunkenness, directly or indirectly, enters into half of the inquests which I hold. When poor folks can't afford gin, some resorted to drinking methylated spirits. A lot were women whose lives comprised a long list of traumas they wanted to escape." Another report stated, "At any of the public houses in my district, go where you will, you'll find more women than men, and these in many cases are young women, some not over the age of 22. People drank at all hours. But what about kids? Who took care of the kids? Many poor kids roamed the streets, since after the 1833 Factory Act, children under 9 weren't supposed to work at all, and children 9 to 13 could work no more than 9 hours a day. From 13 to 18, they could work no more than 12 hours a day. But this meant more mothers looking after kids who'd formerly been in the mines and factories, and that meant more time to drink. This was criticized much more than it was analyzed. Another report said, "Visiting along a lane in my district recently at 11 o'clock in the morning, I met drunken women in 3 houses consecutively, all being mothers with large families. Unfortunately, many of the witnesses you'll hear about in this show were blind drunk at the time of the crime." London was sodden with cheap hooch, creating a long line of very unreliable witnesses to serious crimes. Back to Martha. When she died, William was staying at the Workingmen's Home on Commercial Street, and Martha at a common lodging house on George Street, Spitalfields. The last time he saw her alive was on August 4th, when he met her at the junction of Leadenhall Street and Aldgate High Street. She told him she was out of cash, so he gave her 1 shilling and 6 pence. Records show that wages for a 10-hour and 6-day week in London in the late 1800s was 3 shillings and 9 pence per week for common laborers. For bricklayers, smiths, masons, and carpenters, the wage was 6 shillings and 6 pence per week, 12 pence was 1 shilling, and 240 pence was a pound. Women upholsterers might get 9 shillings a week, and a male workshop apprentice 8 to 10 shillings a week. Those people who walked around wearing sandwich boards advertising various goods were paid 1 shilling to 1 shilling 8 pence per day in 1894. The cost of a single room per week for a lower-paid person might have ranged from 3 to 6 shillings, but the temporary lodgings, aka the doss house or flop house, places you'll hear about throughout today's show, were much cheaper. Some beds were just 6 pence or even 4 pence a night, but unlike the workhouse, there wasn't any back-breaking labor involved. 4 pence in today's money is about $2. The cheapest form of a night's sleep was 2 pence. For that, people were offered a rope to hang over all night. This was sometimes called the 2-penny hangover or the lean-to. Many of the people you'd find there were just children, beggars, pickpockets, or as people called them, little scoundrels. Compared to the cold street, the rope was a luxury. At around 5 in the morning, the rope was cut, whether or not its hangers were awake or asleep. There were also the penny sit-ups, a room perhaps heated, but where sleeping wasn't allowed. Monitors would walk around waking people up. Better were the Salvation Army's 4 or 5 penny coffins, wooden boxes where people could sleep for the night, and were offered a blanket, a cup of tea, and a slice of bread. The writer George Orwell later remarked, "It is cold, and the worst thing about it is the bugs. which being enclosed in a box you cannot escape. William was staying at a workhouse where the working conditions were brutal and the diet consisted of a lot of porridge. And Martha was at a lodging house where she was packed in with other women for her 6 pence a night. One person usually got 8 hours of the bed, after which another woman would take it. Lodging house beds were allocated through a kind of timeshare where prostitutes could disappear for 16 hours and come home to an empty bed. In Whitechapel at the time of Jack the Ripper, there were 233 common lodging houses home to around 8,000 people, many of them thieves, drunkards, and prostitutes who'd often defecated into pots, making the places stink and rendering the inhabitants vulnerable to disease and diarrhea. There were close to 1,200 prostitutes in Whitechapel in 1888, most of whom worked on the streets, but also in the 62 brothels. This was an area of 357 acres that someone could cover on foot in 20-odd minutes. So there were a lot of prostitutes. Gangs ran these streets, demanding protection money from the shopkeepers and extorting the prostitutes. Fallen women were seen as fair game. The entire area was chaotic. Not even the police would dare go down some streets. When William gave Martha the money, the weather had been bitterly cold and raining. Martha was desperate for a room for the night. Even so, she began her evening having drinks with Mary Ann Connolly, aka Pearlie Paul. At 11 p.m., Martha's sister-in-law, Ann Morris, saw her in White Swan Pub on Whitechapel High Street. Martha was with Mary, the two being bought drinks by 2 soldiers, a corporal and a private. All 4 left the pub together but split up at George Yard. It was time for sex, the infamous Whitechapel back alley bonk. Mary took her soldier to Angel Alley, a filthy place home to poor Irish migrants known for fighting and chasing rent collectors away, often used as a shortcut to Brick Lane. The East London Advertiser called it one of the most dangerous streets in the locality. Martha and her man chose the next alley at George Yard. At around 2 a.m., Police Constable Thomas Barrett was patrolling past the alleys when he noticed a soldier and remarked that he was a long way from his barracks. For the soldier to tell him that he was waiting for his friend, who'd gone off with a woman. At 3:30 a.m., 21-year-old Alfred George Crow, a driver, got back to his house in George Yard buildings. He thought he saw something on the ground on the first floor but ignored it. Drunks and the homeless often lay around the building. But when at around 4:45 a.m. the casual laborer John Saunders Reeves saw something on the floor, there was already enough light to see that it was a woman. He saw blood and immediately ran to find a policeman. He soon returned to the scene of the crime with Constable Barrett, who subsequently fetched Dr. Timothy Killeen. Killeen later wrote that the deceased had been victim of a frenzied attack, with the perpetrator stabbing the woman 39 times. He'd even changed knives, stabbing her with a regular pocket knife, but also what he said was possibly a sword bayonet or dagger. At first, police did not know the identity of the victim, so they released a description to the newspapers. The body, which was that of a woman apparently between 35 and 40 years of age, about 5 foot 3 inches in height, complexion and hair dark, wore a dark green skirt, a brown petticoat, a long black jacket, and a black bonnet. The East London Observer described the crime as one of the most terrible cases that anyone can possibly imagine. The man must have been a perfect savage to have attacked the woman in that way. Inspector Edmund Reed tried to ascertain who the soldier was that Constable Barrett had seen. Reed interviewed suspects at a local barracks but identified no one. On August 9th, Mary came forward and identified the body. The East London Observer wrote the next day, Inspector Reed, accompanied by Pearlie Paul, proceeded to the Tower on Monday afternoon, where she was confronted with every non-commissioned officer and private who was on leave of absence at the time of the outrage. She failed to pick any man out whom she and Martha had been with that night. She might have been drunk, but she told Reed she remembered the men had white bands around their caps, meaning they were likely from the Coldstream Guards. She later picked 2 men out, but it turned out that it couldn't have been them. Both had alibis. Mary was not a reliable witness. The South Wales Echo reported on Monday, August 20th, Pearlie Paul is a dangerous person to trust. She bamboozled the police into the idea that she could give them a clue to the Whitechapel murder. The mysterious soldiers were never found. The East London Advertiser commented that there was a feeling of insecurity when a woman could be so brutally murdered as people slept close by, and a killer could disappear without a trace or clue being left. These crimes became known as the Whitechapel murders, but by no means it's assured that Jack the Ripper was the perpetrator of them all. Some ripperologists have even said he might have committed 13 murders in all. There were investigators at the time of the killings who said the Ripper only killed 4 or 5 or 6, but for the most part people agree on 5. These 5 have what the cops call a similar signature and modus operandi. They are the canonical 5. On the night of August 30th, 31st, the weather report for London stated that on this night, the second day of the moon's last quarter, it would be partly cloudy but fine. It wasn't fine for a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. It was the worst night of her life. Born Mary Ann Walker on August 26, 1845, not far from the famed Fleet Street in London, Mary was the daughter of Edward Walker, a locksmith, and his wife Caroline. In 1864, Mary, then just 18, got hitched to a printer's machinist named William Nichols. Life was good. At least it was for a while, until young William had an affair with the midwife who helped deliver their fourth kid. The relationship had been failing for quite some time anyway, with William saying he'd had enough of his wife's compulsive boozing. The two split up in 1880, with the kids staying with William, barring one of the boys who went to live with his grandfather. Now Mary was in trouble, barely able to survive on the 5 shillings a week that William gave her as an allowance. In 1882, when he found out his former beloved was working as a prostitute, he stopped the payments completely. Mary went to live with her dad, but her constant drunkenness didn't work out for him either, so she ended up in a workhouse. The doss houses were cheap, but way better than the workhouse. The workhouse for poor Victorians was seen as the end of the line. Mary later managed to land a job as a domestic servant for Samuel and Sarah Cowdery, but after 2 months she stole £3 10 shillings from them and hit the road, ending up in a lodging house on 18 Thrall Street, sharing a room with a woman named Emily Holland, as well as 4 other women. On the fateful night, Mary was 43 years old. She might have just been 5 feet 2, but she looked like she knew how to scrap, with a scar on her forehead and missing her front teeth. They'd been knocked out in a street fight. That night, August 30th, she was spotted walking down Whitechapel Road. Like many nights for Mary, this one was grim. She'd earlier been kicked out of her lodging since she didn't have the 4 pence for the bed. Still, she was adamant she'd get her DOS money soon, telling the lodging house deputy as if she didn't care about the room, "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." At about 12:30, now August 31st, she was seen coming out of the Frying Pan pub. The night wasn't fine, as the weather forecast had predicted. It was now raining. At 2:30 a.m., Mary was seen by Emily Holland on the corner of Osborne Street and Brick Lane. Emily told Mary she'd just been at Shadwell Dry Dock watching the fire. In those days, there were often fires in London, which at times were like spectator sports. Emily later said Mary was steaming drunk. Emily tried to persuade her to go with her back to Thrall Street. It seems Mary had indeed gotten her DOS money, telling Emily, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it." She promised Emily that she'd be back at the lodgings another time. At 3:15 a.m., Constable John Thane walked past Bucks Row while on his regular beat. PC John Neal was also around Bucks Row at that time, as was Sergeant Kirby. None of them saw anything suspicious, but at 3:40, a carman, like a delivery driver, named Charles A. Cross noticed something on the ground close to the gates that led up to New Cottage. He thought at first it was just a tarpaulin, a sheet, but when he crossed the road, he noticed it was the body of a woman on the path with her hands by her sides. Lying at her side was a black straw bonnet trimmed with black velvet. Her eyes were open, her skirts were raised almost to her stomach. Robert Paul, another carman, soon joined Cross, both men now in shock at what lay before them. After feeling her cold hand, Cross said the woman was dead. Although Paul felt her cheek, and since it was still warm, he said she was likely alive. They both went in search of a policeman, later finding PC Misen at the corner of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row. At 3:44 a.m., Constable Neal came across the body. She was dead, there was no doubt about that. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, although she was indeed quite warm, leading Neal to believe she'd only recently died. The killer was no doubt nearby. Misen was soon on the scene, as was PC Thane, who later said he arrived at 3:47. It was Thane who went off to find Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn at 152 Whitechapel Road, knocking at the doctor's door and waking him up. Meanwhile, Neal went to try to find a stretcher to get more help, this time from Bethnal Green Police Station. By this time, the slaughtermen, James Mumford and Henry Tompkins, were on the scene. They stood back as Dr. Llewellyn examined the body, noting the severe cuts to the throat and also noting that the woman's legs were warm. As Sergeant Kirby joined what was now a small crowd, on Dr. Llewellyn's orders, the body was taken to the mortuary shed at Old Montague Street Workhouse Infirmary. PC Thane awaited Inspector John Spratling of H Division at the scene of the crime, just as the son of a Mrs. Green cleaned up the blood in the street. The lack of blood would lead to various theories. Some believed the woman had been killed elsewhere and dumped there. But Inspector Aberline, whom you'll meet again in the show, was sure the woman had been killed there on Bucks Row. At about 5 a.m., PC Neal and Inspector Spratling went to the mortuary for an update on the body. They were taken aback when informed by Dr. Llewellyn the victim's abdomen had been violently slashed open, exposing her intestines. At 6:30 a.m., two men from the Whitechapel workhouse were given the unenvious task of washing the victim's body, despite entreaties from Detective Sergeant Enright that she shouldn't be cleaned yet. On September 1st at 10 a.m., Dr. Llewellyn began his full post-mortem examination of the body. He first noticed a bruise on the woman's face, believing that the killer had likely held her head as he sliced through her throat, which were actually two cuts, both penetrating the spine, some 4 inches and 8 inches in length. There was a deep, jagged cut on her abdomen that reached all the way to her breastbone, as well as a series of smaller cuts and 3 or 4 similar cuts down her right side. The doctor assumed the cutting instrument was a large knife of average sharpness. He believed all these cuts would have taken 4 or 5 minutes, stating that the killer may have had some rough knowledge of human anatomy, though no organs had been removed from the body. It seemed the killer was left-handed and had attacked the victim from the front, although the doctor later said the killer may have been right-handed and attacked her from behind. Later that same day at the Whitechapel Lads Institute, Coroner Baxter held an inquest in front of a crowd of excited journalists and citizens. 3 witnesses spoke on the first day and 8 on the second. By this time, Mary had already been identified by her friend Emily and by another woman, Mary Monk, from the Lambeth workhouse. Mary's clothes showed a laundry mark of that workhouse. On seeing the body, ex-husband William cried out, "Seeing you as you are now, I forgive you for what you have done to me." Inspector Aberline, the former head of Whitechapel CID, returned from Scotland Yard to work on the case. The investigation was at first headed by Robert Anderson, but due to sickness he was replaced by Detective Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland. They believed gangs were likely the culprits, but still interviewed the 2 slaughterhouse workers. Both had alibis. The cops were unsure, but that didn't stop the press from writing sensational stories. They talked of a man referred to as Leather Apron, who apparently had stalked, threatened, and robbed a number of local prostitutes. The East London Observer's description was tantalizing for its readers, stating about this man, his face was not altogether pleasant to look upon by reason of the grisly black strips of hair, nearly an inch in length, which almost covered his face. The thin lips too had a cruel sardonic kind of look, which was increased if anything by the drooping dark mustache and side whiskers. The press explained that this scary man was the Hebrew type, a Jew. It's important to state here that with so many Jews coming to London from Europe, there was rampant anti-Semitism. Only 8 days into the investigation, with public anger boiling up over the mysterious Jew in his leather apron, another body was found. The panic went up a notch. The victim was Annie Chapman. Annie, known to her friends as Dark Annie, was born in the Paddington area of London in 1841. She married John Chapman, a coachman, when she was 27, and together they had 3 children. Annie's life did not turn out to be a bed of roses. In 1882, she lost a 12-year-old daughter to meningitis. Her crippled son John was placed in care. Her other daughter left the family to go to France, leaving Annie daughterless. She split up with John and for a time survived on the 10 shillings a week allowance he sent to her. Then he died in 1886. He too was a heavy drinker, dying from liver cirrhosis. Annie went to live with Jack Sivey, a sieve maker, but her drinking got the better of her and he left. Annie's brother Fontaine later told the press that his sister had first took a drink when she was quite young, and despite warnings from him and her sisters, she always went back to the rum, her poison of choice. It was then that she followed a trajectory of so many women in London, ending up at a lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. To make ends meet, she often sold flowers and did crochet work, but when money was scarce, she turned to prostitution. At times, a 47-year-old bricklayer's laborer named Edward the Pensioner Stanley paid for her bed. Annie felt like she'd lost everything. It was at this point that her friend said she became severely depressed, often talking about how she wanted to die. A week before her death, Annie had been banged up in a fight with Eliza Cooper, who'd accused her of stealing a bar of soap at the lodging house. Another story says Annie noticed Eliza stealing from a man named Harry, and they fought over that. A few days later, she was taken ill, treated not for the black eye she sustained in the fight, but for a general feeling of malaise. On the date of her death, September 7th, this 47-year-old woman looked a state. Standing at 5 feet, rather plump with dark brown hair and blue eyes, she had a thick nose and fair skin. She still had bruising on her face and had lost 2 front teeth in a fight. Her autopsy revealed the rest of her teeth were okay, explaining the front teeth were perfect as far as the first molar, top and bottom, and very fine. At 5 p.m. that evening, her friend Amelia Palmer saw her on Dorset Street. Annie was sober, but feeling ill. Amelia asked if she was going to Stratford, likely where Annie would pick up men. Annie told her, "I must pull myself together and go out and get some money or I shall have no lodgings." At 11:30, she headed to Crossingham Lodging House and asked for permission to go to the kitchen, where at around midnight, she's seen by William Stevens. After producing a box, she tells him she's been to the hospital. On opening the box, she pulls out 2 pills. The 2 have a beer. Annie, Stevens will later say, was already drunk by then. Seems she'd gotten 5 pence from her sister in Vauxhall, but instead of using it for a place to bed down for the night, she spent it on drinks. Beer ads from the 1880s tell us you could get a pint for 2 pence. Gin, aka Mother's Ruin, was very cheap if a person couldn't afford beer. At 1:35 a.m., John Evans, the night watchman at the lodging house, asks Annie for the 4 pence for the bed for the night. She tells him she has no money, then explains to Timothy Donovan, the deputy, that if he'd be so kind as to hold the bed, she'll go out to get the 4 pence and soon pay him. So Annie needs to make 4 pence fast. But she was 47, not so pretty and bashed up from fighting. She was ill. So you might wonder then, how much could she make on the streets as a prostitute? This is something we should explain to help you better understand the lives of the Victorian poor. It's hard to say exactly how much sex with a Whitechapel prostitute would cost in those days, since a lot would depend on her age, how desperate she was, or maybe he was, and what exactly the act involved. It's generally thought that a quickie down a dark alley with a low-cost sex worker was about 4 pence. That was the absolute bargain basement of sex work. It meant a roof over your head for one night. The best work was when highly attractive women were in the service of aristocrats or even politicians. These women might have been referred to as courtesans, but payment for sex was the name of the game. Some married those rich men as a way to achieve safety in a world where they had few opportunities. One former courtesan wrote in her memoirs, "I shall not say why and how I became at the age of 15 the mistress of the Earl of Craven." It was very common back then for rich men to buy the bodies of women, or shall we say girls. According to W.T. Steed, an investigative journalist who famously died on the Titanic, a rich man could have a medical examiner check a girl's virginity status. If she was indeed a virgin, her services could be bought for 5 whole pounds. She could only sell this service once, of course, something rich men happily paid for given the pervasiveness of venereal disease in those days. You'll remember that 1 pound was 240 pence, so 5 pounds was 1,200 pence. You could rent a 3-room place in Soho, then quite a rundown area, for 14 to 20 shillings a week, 168 pence to 240 pence. Ergo, 5 pounds was a lot. Prostitution was one way an uneducated poor woman could earn a decent living, although decent was not a word usually used to describe that living. Steed's journalism shocked the entire country, which led to the government introducing the age of consent laws under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. In a memoir published in 1888, a man explains that he paid as much as 5 shillings for intercourse and 1 shilling for what he described as a feel. As is true today, the cost between high-end and low-end was vast, but at 47, ailing, not too pretty, with missing teeth and a bruised face, Annie would very likely have inhabited the bottom rung of the ladder for prostitution for the so-called fallen women. Her services, we imagine, were cheap. The last words Timothy Donovan said to her were, "You can find money for your beer, and you can't find money for your bed." Annie then walked out into the street and heads to Brushfield Street and on towards Spatial Fields Market. At 3:30 a.m., a carman named Thompson leaves for work. His room is at 29 Hanbury Street, which is home to 17 people living in 8 rooms. It's cramped there, but better than Crossingham, which is just a few yards down the street. At 4:45 a.m., a man named John Richardson, the son of one of the occupants of 29 Hanbury Street, stops in the yard of a house, a small area measuring 14 square feet. He bends down to cut some leather from his boot with a knife as his toes are hurting. He sits there for about 2 minutes and sees nothing suspicious. At some point between 5:20 and 5:30, a carpenter named Albert Kadosh, who lives in a room at 27 Hanbury Street, walks outside and thinks he hears people talking. At 29, he can't see much since the houses are divided by a 5-foot fence. He thinks he hears a woman say no. He then thinks he hears a scuffle and someone falling against the fence, but then everything goes quiet. On his way to Spitalfields, he sees nothing suspicious. At 5:30, Elizabeth Long walks down Hanbury Street on her way to Spitalfields Market, and she sees a man and a woman talking outside House 29. The woman she will identify later as Annie Chapman. The man she can't see well since he's standing with his back toward her, but she can make out that he's about 40 and taller than Annie. She can see he has a dark complexion and what she will call a shabby, genteel appearance, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark coat. Long will say she is sure this guy is foreign. She'll hear the man say, "Will you?" and Annie say, "Yes." She was sure it was 5:30 exactly since she heard the clock at the Black Eagle Brewery on Brick Lane strike for half an hour. At 5:45, Carman John Davis wakes up. Davis goes downstairs and into the yard, whereupon he sees the body of a woman lying parallel to the fence. Her head is about 6 inches from the bottom step, her feet pointing toward the shed, her left arm lying across her chest. Her throat has been cut, her skirts are up to her waist, her face is completely covered in blood. In shock, Davis runs out into the street, where he shouts in the direction of a man named Henry Holland. Two other men, James Green and James Kent, both about to go to work at a packing case manufacturer, are standing at house number 23. All the men see the body and head off in different directions. Green goes to work, Kent goes looking for a policeman but gives up and elects instead to go for a glass of brandy to steady his nerves. He soon returns with a sheet to place over what he can see as a very cut-up woman. It's Davis who first gets to the cops when he arrives at 6 a.m. at the Commercial Street Police Station. Still panting from the run, he explains to Inspector John Chandler the gruesome discovery. By the time Chandler gets to the body with a couple of his men, there's already a crowd. He soon sends for Dr. George Bagster Phillips, a police surgeon, and ensures somebody gets the news to Scotland Yard. When Phillips arrives, he notes the victim's left arm is lying across her breast. Her knees are bent outward. He writes, "The face is swollen and turned on the right side. The tongue protrudes between the front teeth but not beyond the lips. The tongue is evidently much swollen." The body is already showing signs of rigor mortis. Her neck has been sliced with jagged incisions. Blood from her neck has pooled on the floor, and some has spattered into the fence. The doctor believes she died in the spot since there's no signs of blood elsewhere in the yard. He thinks she's been dead about 2 hours. Chandler and Phillips tell the crowd to get back, both of them searching for clues around the yard. They come across a woman's belongings, a pocket comb, a small tooth comb, and a small envelope containing 2 pills. On the right side of the envelope, the letter M is written. On the other, there's a seal for the Sussex Regiment. 2, maybe 3 brass rings are missing from her fingers. A leather apron is found close by, but it'll turn out to be the property of a local man. Detective Sergeant Thick arrives, as does Sergeant Leake and later Inspector Aberline. Everyone thinks the same thing. This looks like the work of the person who killed Marianne Nichols. They have a madman on their hands. On September 8th, Dr. Phillips, after showing his annoyance at 2 nurses for washing the body without his permission, begins his post-mortem examination. A report of his findings issued sometimes later reads, "There was a bruise over the right temple, on the upper eyelid there was a bruise, and there were 2 distinct bruises, each the size of a man's thumb, on the forepart of the top of the chest. The stiffness of the limbs was now well marked. There was a bruise over the middle part of the bone of the right hand. The cut through the throat is severe. He notices her lungs are diseased, and so too is her brain. This woman had a little time to live, he believes. There wasn't much food in her stomach. She was malnourished. He believed the killer had held her chin while cutting her throat, which was sliced from left to right." The report stated, "The abdomen had been entirely laid open. The intestines, severed from the mesenteric attachments, had been lifted out of the body and placed on the shoulder of the corpse, whilst from the pelvis the uterus and its appendages, with the upper portion of the vagina and the posterior 2/3 of the bladder, had been entirely removed. This had been done in a way to avoid damaging the other organs." The report said, "Obviously the work was that of an expert, of one at least who had such knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be able to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife. Even the way the neck was cut," said the report, "seemed to indicate great anatomical knowledge. If the doctor himself had done such an operation, it would have taken the best part of an hour, and a considerable amount of skill and anatomical knowledge. The weapon," he said, "would not have been an ordinary knife, but either a surgeon's amputating knife or a slaughterman's knife." He did say that he thought she'd been strangled first before he cut her throat, and went to work on her internal organs. On September 10th, when Baxter led the inquest, he didn't include all these details out of fear of upsetting those in attendance. It was believed that Annie had been killed about 4:20, but this didn't gel with witness statements that had been heard. The people that would have seen her body, especially John Richardson, who when he bent down to fix his shoes, surely would have noticed a dead woman sliced and diced on the ground. Baxter concluded that Richardson just didn't go down the steps, so he missed her. As for the others who heard her, Baxter said they must have been mistaken about the time. On September 26, Baxter announced that whoever had committed this heinous crime must have had some anatomical knowledge, more than an animal slaughterer would have. The precision of the organ removal was just too good for a layman. It was Baxter's early contention that the murder had something to do with an American man who it was rumored had been in London looking to buy human organs. Still, he seemed to drop this line of inquiry in later inquests. On September 15th, the Daily Telegraph reported, "The funeral of Annie Chapman took place early yesterday morning, the utmost secrecy having been observed, and none but the undertaker, police, and relatives of the deceased knew anything about the arrangements." The public all asked one thing: how does a man who obviously was covered in blood, carrying a knife as well as human organs, just glide through the city full of people on their way to their early morning jobs? London was aflame with conspiracy theories. People gathered around Hanbury Street to see where it happened, so many of them that the people turned up with their hand carts to sell fruits and vegetables. Hawkers scurried around, pickpockets came, women in bonnets offered men a good time. The British Home Office refrained from offering a reward out of fear it would cause people to lie and confuse the police. The press again talked about leather apron. Some people screamed, "Foreigners," blaming the Jewish population. Jews were verbally assaulted on their way to work. Police did everything to stop a riot from happening. You could cut the tension with a dagger. There were a few suspects. German hairdresser Charles Ludwig, who police dragged in for questioning, as they did William Piggott, a drunk who'd been heard threatening to hurt women in the Pope's Head pub in Gravesend, Kent. It turns out Piggott, like many poor Londoners, was mentally unwell, once likely a resident of the asylum. Records show he had a history of alcoholic withdrawal delirium tremens, which can in some cases result in strange or aggressive psychotic behavior. Jacob Eisenschmidt was another suspect. This man, known as the Crazy Butcher, was a Swiss butcher with a history of mental illness. He was said to have carried a knife and been violent toward women. Police were looking for a crazy person as insane crazy, since they didn't think any normal person could commit such atrocities. They were wrong, of course. Serial killers very often look normal. Jack the Ripper might have been a friendly neighbor, a good Samaritan, a father of loving children. When police heard that Eisenschmidt had lost his business and he'd become depressed and aggressive, as well as spending time at an asylum for severe psychiatric disorders, they thought they might have their man. Soon the press was saying the Whitechapel killer was without a doubt the Crazy Butcher. Yet they soon changed their tune. The Crazy Butcher was living inside a straitjacket in an asylum when the next woman was murdered. First, who was Leather Apron? His name was Jack Pizer. Police got hold of him on September 10th. He was 5'4", with a tanned face and a dark mustache. After being taken to Leman Street Police Station, investigators found 5 long-bladed knives at his house. Even worse, a Hanbury Street resident named Emmanuel Delblast Violinia said he'd seen Pizer threatening to stab a woman on September 8th. Violinia made contradictory statements, so Pizer was released after 36 hours of questioning. Violinia was unreliable, according to Aberline. That was probably true. In 1889, Violinia's plans for emigration to Australia fell through, and months later he was arrested and charged with indecent assault on 3 girls in Oxford. He was subsequently attacked with an iron bar in prison by a prisoner named Charles Atkinson. These were the kinds of people Whitechapel police had as witnesses. Many of them were unreliable. Some ripperologists have said that Violinia only came forward as a witness so he could see the mutilated dead body of the victim. It's known he was a liar, once claiming to have 18 children in his 18 years in London after arriving from Spain. Pizer was Jewish, which seemed to please some of the more xenophobic newspapers, but despite what the media said about him, crazy Jew and half beast, half man, there was no evidence he was a killer. He had alibis for the murders. For one, he'd been with relatives. For another, he'd been talking to a policeman as they both watched a massive fire burn at some warehouses that had gone up in flames. While some of the media in England called out those newspapers for their fantastical misinformation, many of the poor believed it, which put Pizer at risk of a mob beating. In the end, Pizer sued some of the papers, while the police had to calm the mad crowds down by publicly stating there was no evidence whatsoever against Mr. Pizer. The residents of Whitechapel were so worried about what was going on in their area that they formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Now people were on the lookout, but Mr. Ripper was about to take things a step further. On September 29th to 30th, the London weather was noted as cloudy with rain, clearing after midnight, a chilly night. Chilly indeed, especially for a woman named Elizabeth Stride, born on November 27, 1843, in Gothenburg, Sweden, with the name Elizabeth Gustafsdotter. In London, her nickname was Long Liz. Her father Gustav was a farmer and her mother Beata was a housewife. It seems Sweden wasn't much better for Liz than London. In 1865, records showed that she was arrested for prostitution in Gothenburg. That year, she gave birth to a stillborn child, and she was treated 2 times at a hospital in Kyrhuset for sexually transmitted diseases. The next year, she moved to London. A man who lodged in the same lodging house later testified that she'd come to London in the service of a foreign gentleman. People who knew her said she would do a good turn for anyone, but it was only a matter of time until London would chew her up and spit her out. 3 years later, she married John Stride. The two seemed to have a decent life living on East India Dock Road in Poplar, East London, after which they started running a coffee shop at Crisp Street. But it seems the coffee shop didn't do too well. Liz had some jobs on the side, but also occasionally prostituted herself. It's reported that during this era, as much as 50% of street vendors doubled as prostitutes. Notably, at some point, she runs into a man named Dr. Thomas Barnardo. He was at her lodging house asking people how they thought children could be saved from the contamination of the common lodging houses and the street. He's one of the people that will later see her dead body and confirm he'd seen her that day. He's also the reason that the children's charity Barnardo's exists today and does great work. The charity probably doesn't like the fact that he's connected to the Ripper murders. More about that later. Disaster struck on September 3rd when John Stride was one of the 600 to 700 people who died when the Princess Alice passenger steamer was hit on the Thames by a huge cargo ship, the SS Bywell Castle. The passengers died horrifically in the water, where 75 million imperial gallons of London's raw sewage had just been dumped. They literally drowned with their heads deep in poop. A writer for the Times newspaper recalled, 2 continuous columns of decomposed fermenting sewage, hissing like soda water with baneful gases so black that the water is stained for miles, and discharging a corrupt charnel house odor that'll be remembered by all as being particularly depressing and sickening. Like watching fires, sightseers came from far and wide to watch the cleanup effort, and the bodies get fished out of the water. With 5 shillings up for grabs for just one body, fights broke out over the rotting, bloated corpses. The water was so disgusting and toxic that it rotted the clothes off the bodies. 16 people who survived the crash were pulled out, later dying in the hospital. Liz said her 2 children also died in the disaster. Some historians have asked if she made this up in an effort to receive sympathy and compensation, but whatever the case, John and her 2 kids went missing. Liz also said the reason she was missing most of her front teeth was because she was on the sinking boat and was kicked in the mouth when it went down. Still, John may have died of heart disease in 1884. The jury is still out on this matter, it'll always be. What is certain is that in 1885, Liz started living with waterside laborer Michael Kidney, although the relationship was strained due to Liz's heavy drinking. He tried to padlock her in the house, but of course that wasn't going to help with her alcoholism. From 1887 to 1888, she appeared in Thames Magistrate Court for 8 separate cases of drunk and disorderly. She and Michael broke up a few times but were living together at 33 Dorset Street at the time of her demise. He too was a drunk, often staying at the workhouse, and once spending 3 days in prison in July 1888 for being drunk and disorderly and using obscene language. On September 29, 1888 at approximately 6:30 p.m., Liz was seen by Elizabeth Tanner at the Queen's Head pub on Commercial Street. Tanner is the deputy at the lodging house of 32 Flower and Dean Street. She's paid 6 pence to Liz on this day for some cleaning duties. They both drink together and later walk back to the lodging house. Liz is now 44, 5'2", with brown curly hair and light gray eyes. She's pale and missing all of her upper front teeth. That's what Charles Preston sees at the lodging house when she asks to borrow a clothes brush from him. Catherine Lane is also there and at one point is handed a piece of velvet from Liz. Liz tells Catherine she's going out, proudly showing her 6 pence that she's earned. At 11 p.m., the laborer J. Best sees Liz at Bricklayer's Arms on Settle Street. He later says that he was surprised at seeing a woman kissing a man that was respectably dressed. That man is described as 5'5", wearing a small black morning suit and a black bowler hat. He has a thick black mustache. Best jokes with his buddy that the guy must be Leather Apron about to kill another woman. They jokingly shout over to the woman, "That's Leather Apron getting round you." The man and Catherine walk off toward Commercial Road and Burner Street. Best later says he and the woman went off like a shot soon after 11. Sometime between 11 and midnight, fruit seller Matthew Packer in front of his room at 44 Burner Street sells a man and a woman some fruit. The location is 2 doors down from Duftfield's yard. Packer later says the man is aged 30 to 35, medium height, and has dark hair and a dark complexion. He'll later identify the woman as Liz, although he will say a lot of contradictory things to police. At 11:45, laborer William Marshall is outside of his house at 64 Burner Street. He also sees a man and a woman, this time outside house number 63. They look drunk and are kissing. He hears the man say, "You wouldn't say anything but your prayers." The couple then walks off in the direction of Duftfield's yard. William later says the man was well dressed, with a black cutaway coat dark trousers, and a cap, like a sailor's cap. He says the man was clean-shaven, stout in build and average height. At 12:35 a.m., PC William Smith is walking his beat when he sees a woman with a man wearing a hard felt hat. They're standing opposite the International Working Men's Educational Club, a socialist club whose members are mostly Jewish. Smith will say that the man was about 5'7", with a small dark mustache, wearing a dark cutaway coat. He's carrying a parcel 18 inches long and 6 to 8 inches wide, wrapped with newspaper. The woman, who he'll later confirm is Liz, was wearing a red flower pinned to her jacket. Israel Schwartz says he too saw a woman with a red flower pinned to her, talking with a man who was dressed in a dark jacket, dark trousers, wearing a black cap with a peak. This man, about 30, had dark hair and a dark mustache. He will say the man tried to pull the woman down the street, and then he pushed her into a doorway. The woman screamed, but not loudly. Notably, he says he saw another man across the street smoking a clay pipe. He was tall, about 35, wearing a dark overcoat and a black felt hat. Schwartz will say the two men might have been accomplices. The statement kicked off rumors that the Ripper had a partner, and so the crimes were part of a conspiracy of well-dressed men. At 12:45 a.m., a dock worker named James Brown sees a woman he will later say is Liz. She's standing with her back against a wall at the corner of Burner Street, talking to a guy of average size wearing a long black coat. Brown will tell police the woman said, "No, not tonight, some other night." When Brown arrives home at 35 Fairclough Street 15 minutes later, he hears cries of police and murder. A woman named Fanny Mortimer was standing outside of her house on Burner Street from 12:30 to 1, and she says she saw nobody leave or enter Duftfield Yard, which is right next to her house. Louis Daimschutz, a Russian Jew and cheap jewelry seller, tries to drop his pony off at Duftfield's yard at 1 a.m. The pony is reluctant to go in. Daimschutz later says, "I jumped down at once and struck a match. It was rather windy and I could not get a light sufficient to show that it was a figure of some person, whom by the dress I knew to be a woman." He ran to 40 Burner Street, where the International Working Men's Educational Club was located. Daimschutz was a steward there. He'll later say that the Ripper might have been in the shadows when he saw the woman, and that the Ripper may have run away when he went to the club. On returning to the scene with Isaac Kozabrodsky, a tailor's machinist, the two used a candlelight to see the body. Blood was now evident. Daimschutz said, "The right arm was over the belly, the back of the hand and the wrist had clotted blood on it, the legs were drawn up with the feet close to the wall, the body and the face were warm and the hand cold. The legs were quite warm. The deceased had a silk handkerchief around her neck, and it appeared to be slightly torn." At 1:04 to 1:07, PC Henry Lamb and PC Edward Collins arrived at the scene, where there were now about 15 people. Lamb couldn't find a pulse. He then ran off to 100 Commercial Road to find Dr. Blackwell, who sent his assistant Edward Johnston ahead of him. When Dr. Blackwell arrived at 1:16, he said that he thought the victim had been dead for about 20 to 30 minutes, meaning the Ripper might well have been in the shadows when Daimschutz and his pony entered the yard. At 3 p.m. on Monday at St. George's Mortuary, Dr. Blackwell said that the woman was slightly malnourished. He wrote, "There was a clear-cut incision on the neck. It was 6 inches in length and commenced 2.5 inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw, 3/4 of an inch over an undivided muscle, and then becoming deeper, dividing the sheath." The East London Advertiser wrote on October 13th that police were going to bring bloodhounds to Whitechapel. Critics at the time said it was just for show. One writer said the newspapers openly mocked Sir Charles and his bloodhound theory. "Bloodhounds in Whitechapel," they cried, "is sheer stupidity. And what type of fool is the commissioner?" came the chorus theme. Some of the papers called the victim Lucky Liz because she hadn't been disemboweled like the others. What was strange is no blood was found on her clothing nor on the wall nearby. The theory was that Daimschutz might have scared him away before he had a chance to tear her apart. But it was thought that since she was a middle-aged prostitute and she had her throat cut from left to right like the others, she was definitely a victim of the Ripper. Some newspapers said she was clutching grapes at the time of her murder, but this was not true. Liz was buried in a pauper's grave, number 15,509, on September 30th. If Liz was lucky, the next victim was the very opposite of lucky. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. Born in Wolverhampton on April 14, 1842, Catherine had 3 kids with Thomas Conway, who was living on a pension from the 18th Royal Irish Regiment. One of 12 kids to parents that both died young, Catherine had toughed it out as a teenager in the workhouse. After meeting Conway and moving to London, things got ugly. They had 2 kids together but fought bitterly. Conway hated alcohol and didn't drink at all, but Catherine drank at every opportunity. She was often seen with black eyes, the consequences of disagreements the two had. Still, one superintendent of a lodging house said she was not often drunk and was a very jolly woman, often singing. She left Conway, although his initials TC were forever marked on her left forearm in the form of a crude tattoo. She ended up living with an Irish porter, John Kelly, at 55 Flower and Dean Street, which, as you've seen, was a slum at the center of a lot of crime. Of course, on top of Catherine's day job, sewing for Jewish families on Brick Lane, she sold her body at bargain basement prices. John later says they never quarreled at all. At the time of her death, she was 46, had brown hair and brown eyes, and stood at 5 feet tall. On September 27th, she arrived back in London after going hop-picking in Maidstone, Kent. When she arrived at the lodging house, she told the superintendent that she was going to come into money, saying she would collect the reward for telling the police who the Whitechapel murderer was. She said quite calmly, "I know him." She told him, "I have come back to earn the reward offered for the apprehension of the Whitechapel murderer." 2 days later, September 29th, Catherine and Kelly parted ways for a while. Catherine said she was going to try to get some cash from her daughter, while Kelly pawned his boots as a means to afford lodging for the night. Catherine kept the pawn ticket. That evening, Catherine was seen slumped in the street drunk. PC Louis Frederick Robinson took her to the station to sober her up, whereupon, when asked her name, she drunkenly slurred, "Nothing." The next morning at 12:55 a.m., the 30th, now sober, she said her name was Mary Ann Kelly of 6 Fashion Street. She told PC Hutt that she would now receive a damn fine hiding. He replied, "Serves you right, you've no right to get drunk." At 1:34 a.m., Joseph Lavenda, commercial traveler, and Joseph Hyam Levy, butcher, as well as a furniture dealer named Harry Harris, all left the Imperial Club at 1617 Duke's Place. All three saw a woman and a man talking nearby at Church Passage, which led to a place called Mitre Square. They didn't see the woman's face, but would later recognize the clothes. They described them as black straw bonnet trimmed in green and black velvet with black beads, black strings worn and tied to the head, plus a black jacket with imitation fur on the collar and cuffs. The man was 5'8", about 30, wearing a gray cap with a peak, a red neckerchief, and a pepper and salt colored jacket. He had a mustache. The woman, they said, had her hands on the man's chest. Levy then told his friends he hated walking home alone with characters like this hanging about at night. At 1:40, PC James Harvey walks down Church Passage while on his regular beat. He gets to Mitre Square but doesn't enter. He sees nothing suspicious. At this moment, Dr. Blackwell and company are attending to the dead body of Liz Stride over at Duftfield's yard. The distance between Mitre Square and Duftfield's is about 2,800 feet. So, if walking at 3 miles per hour, the distance is about 10.6 minutes. Jack the Ripper would have had plenty of time to find his next victim and engage in his ad hoc surgery. As has happened with other serial killers, his failure might have angered him so much he took more of a risk with the next victim. At 1:45, PC Edward Watkins enters Mitre Square from the other side, and in the southwest corner he discovers a body, that of Catherine. This dark corner is a well-known place where prostitutes take their clients. When a torch is shown on her body, it is evident her throat was cut. Watkins almost jumps back when he shines the torch on her stomach, where her bowels are protruding. He runs to the other side of the square where he finds night watchman and former cop George James Morris. Watkins stays with the body while Morris goes off and finds PC Harvey, who is still close by. Across the street, they call PC Thomas Holland. Yet again, Whitechapel is swarming with police and drunken nighttime stragglers. Yet there is no sign of a man covered in blood carrying a knife. Detective Constable Daniel Halsey later testifies that he asked for the neighborhood to be searched, and every man stopped and examined. Remember, we're talking about only 1 square mile, though admittedly with lots of dark streets. At 1:55, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, police surgeon, arrives at the scene. When the doctor checks the body, he finds the pawn ticket. He'll later write, the intestines were drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. They were smeared with some feculent matter. A piece of about 2 feet was quite detached from the body and placed between the body and the left arm, apparently by design. The lobe and the auricle on the right ear were cut obliquely through. This was one hell of a sight, a nightmarish thing to behold. When she was found, she'd likely been dead for just half an hour. Strangely, there was no blood on her abdomen or thighs, no blood spurts on the bricks or the pavement, no blood on her clothes. He wrote, there were no traces of recent connection. Her heart wasn't beating when he did the surgery. He'd killed her first. In his second exam, Brown wrote, the face was very much mutilated. The upper eyelid on that side, there was a scratch through the skin of the upper left eyelid, near to the angle of the nose. The right eyelid was cut through about half an inch. He said a kidney had been skillfully removed, stating it required a great deal of knowledge to have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed. Still, the police surgeon George Bagster Phillips, who also saw the body, said this didn't mean a professional surgeon had killed the woman. He said a butcher or slaughterman would have been able to do that. Other experts also said this work could have been done by anyone, and that the killer might not have actually been looking for certain organs. It should also be known that at approximately 2:55 a.m., a blood-stained fragment of Catherine's apron was found in a stairway of a tenement building in Whitechapel's Goulston Street. The cop that found it, P.C. Long, said it also had fecal matter on it. On the wall near this piece of important evidence, someone had written, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," with the spelling mistakes too. It sounds like the words of an illiterate person, either blaming Jews or not blaming Jews. Did not be blamed for nothing mean blamed for something? Had Jack the Ripper dropped the apron off on his escape route? That was the way he likely went. Had he cleaned the knife with the apron and thrown it down? Was the graffiti even anything to do with the bloody apron? It was hard to tell. Cops wiped it off, as it was written in chalk. The police did not want it to get out at the time since so much anti-Semitism was already about. Such a statement could have started riots. There was so much confusion among investigators. How did this killer always slip away so easily? Was he really a skilled surgeon? Police left out much of the mutilations to the press, but they didn't have much choice about suppressing what happened next. On September 27th, London Central News Agency received a letter signed by someone calling themselves Jack the Ripper. This is the now famous Dear Boss letter. The first part went, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal." The killer also promised to clip the ears of the next victim and, just for the jolly, send them to the police. This was when the Whitechapel murderer became Jack the Ripper. On October 1st, the same agency received a postcard apparently covered in blood, signed by Saucy Jack, and explaining, "You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not the time to get ears for police." Had the killer murdered these two women and sent the postcard? Or had he read about them and right away the very next morning sent the missive? It was hard to know. Police took both the letter and postcard seriously anyway and printed them in newspapers asking anyone who recognized the handwriting to get in touch. Still, some police thought journalists had written the missives themselves since they knew it would get their newspapers a lot of attention. And as for public help, after Dear Boss, police received masses of hoax letters, around 400 further hampering their investigation. Handwriting analysis in the 20th century says the two could have been written by the same person, but a journalist, it was later found out, may have written both of them. It was on October 16th when a letter now known as the From Hell letter was sent to George Lusk of Whitechapel Vigilance Committee that made police really believe they had the real deal. It read, "From Hell, Mr. Lusk, Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." It also contained a bit of kidney. Lusk thought medical students might have sent the letter as a hoax. Nonetheless, ripperologists these days say the From Hell letter might well be the real thing. After all, Catherine was missing a kidney. That kidney, according to medical analysis, belonged to a heavy drinker, check, who died within the last 3 weeks, check. 20 years later, Major Henry Smith of the city police said the kidney left in the corpse of Catherine Eddowes was in an advanced stage of Bright's disease, and the kidney in the letter also had the disease. Catherine was buried on October 8th in an unmarked grave. Let's now move on to Jack the Ripper's pièce de résistance, a murder with a different modus operandi, but with the same gory signature, albeit more extreme. If you're wondering what the difference is between modus operandi and signature, the first means the actions necessary to commit the crime, i.e. following poor prostitutes into dark streets. The former is described as a pattern of distinctive behaviors that are characteristic of and satisfy emotional and psychological needs. For example, some craziness like staging the body or taking the organs. It's more about the fantasy than the plan of action. Mary Jane Kelly, aka Black Mary, born in Limerick in 1863 in Ireland, was the daughter of John and Mary. She later became the wife of John Davis, who was killed in a coal pit explosion in Wales shortly after they got hitched in 1879. With a not-so-great start to her young adult life, she soon hit the streets in Cardiff to sell her body. Mary at least was young when she arrived in London, young enough to get herself a client with money who took her to France for a while, hence her other name of Mary Jeanette. Now in 1888, living with Joseph Barnett in a cramped room in Miller's Court on Dorset Road, they at least had the 4 shillings a week to pay for the room. But after Joseph lost his job, it was she who brought home the bacon. The problem was, she also brought home other prostitutes when they didn't have a room for the night, which seems to have made Joseph so mad that he moved out. Mary then lived in fear. She hated being alone in that room, especially because Joseph used to read the newspaper stories about the killer. But at just 25, with long blonde hair and blue eyes, slim and about 5'7", Mary had beauty on her side. She even had a full set of teeth, maybe 2 false teeth, and she was intelligent, according to one friend. She was much superior to that of most persons in her position in life. Mary was quiet most of the time. She was a friendly and bright person, but those that knew her said the demon drink sometimes made her loud and abusive. November 8th, 7:30 to 7:45 p.m., Joseph goes to visit Mary at 25 Dorset Street. It's a cold night and rain has been forecast. They might be separated, but they meet almost daily. Lizzie Albrook later confirms she saw them together. Mary actually spoke to Lizzie, telling her, "Whatever you do, don't you do wrong and turn out as I did." 11:45, Mary Ann Cox, who lives at 5 Miller's Court, sees Mary walking with a man. She's wearing a frock and a red shawl over her shoulders. The man, Cox will later say, was about 35. He was 5'5" or thereabouts, had a carroty mustache, was stout, and wore a bowler hat. The couple stopped at 13 Miller's Court. The man was carrying a quart of beer. Cox notices her friend is, in her own words, very much intoxicated. They say goodnight to each other, after which Mary can be heard singing the words, "A violet plucked from my mother's grave when a boy." The song is about someone's family dying and their bygone happy days. When Cox goes back out into the streets around midnight, Mary is still singing that same song. At 12:30, now the 9th, Catherine Pickett, a flower seller who lives close by, is getting annoyed with Mary's constant singing. The noise carries to the neighbor's house, possibly made worse since Joseph had once broken out the window, and instead of replacing the glass, he and Mary had just put a coat over the hole. Catherine tells her husband she's going to tell the woman to stop her loud singing, at which he replies, "You leave the poor woman alone." At about 1 a.m., Cox leaves her house but notices the light is on in the room where the singing is coming from. That's about the time the prostitute Elizabeth Prater is waiting outside Miller's Court for her partner. She waits about half an hour and then goes to a shop owned by a Mr. McCarthy. She's at the shop for about 10 minutes, and this time she didn't see anyone leave Miller's Court, although she also says she heard no singing. She then goes back to her room, number 20 of 26 Dorset Street. She's very drunk, so she gets undressed and tries to sleep. At 2, a man named George Hutchinson, a casual laborer and a resident of the Victoria Workingmen's Home on Commercial Street, walks past a man at the corner of Thrall Street. But even though it's a strange time to be hanging around, he thinks nothing of it. At Flower and Dean Street, he sees Mary, who asks him for cash. She says, "Mr. Hutchinson, can you lend me 6 pence?" "I can't," he replies. "I spent all my money going down Romford." She then says, "I must go and find some money." She walks in the direction of Thrall Street. She soon meets a man, and according to George, Mary says, "All right," to which the man replies, "You'll be all right for what I've told you?" They laugh, and the man puts his arm over Mary's shoulder. George gets a good look at this man when he sees the couple outside the Queen's Head public house. His skin is pale, his mustache is heavy and dark, he has dark eyes and dark hair, what George will later describe as having a, quote, Jewish appearance. The man is wearing a felt hat pulled down over his eyes. His coat is dark, trimmed in astrakhan. He's wearing a black necktie fixed with a horseshoe pin. He's wearing dark spats, boot covers, over light-buttoned boots. George sees this guy has a massive gold chain in his waistcoat, which has a large seal with a red stone hanging from it. The man is carrying kid gloves in his right hand and a small package in his left hand. He's about 5'6" or 5'7", and maybe about 35-36 years old. As the couple walks down Dorset Street, George follows until they stop at the passage that leads to Miller's Court. George hears the woman say, "All right, my dear, come along, you'll be comfortable." The man puts his arm over her, at which point she kisses him. She says, "I've lost my handkerchief," and he pulls one out and gives it to her. They go into Miller's Court, and George stays in the street until the clock strikes 3. At 4, Elizabeth Prater is awoken by her cat Diddles walking across her neck. She hears someone scream murder. Her room is right above Mary's, but she can't tell if that's where the scream came from. She later says she didn't do anything, since in the East End it wasn't unusual to hear someone scream murder. From 5:30 to 5:45, this woman goes to the 10 Bells pub for a glass of rum so she can sleep. On returning home, she sleeps until 11 a.m. At 8, Catherine Pickett goes to Mary's room to ask to borrow a shawl. When she knocks on the door, no one answers. Strange, she thinks. Catherine then heads to the market. It's at this very time that a tailor named Maurice Lewis sees who he thinks is Mary leave her room and return quite quickly. Carolyn Maxwell, married to the deputy of the 14 Dorset Street lodging house, sees Mary at the entrance to Miller's Court. She's wearing a dark skirt, black velvet bodice, and a maroon shawl. Carolyn asks Mary why she's up and about so early, and Mary replies the horrors of drink are upon her, literally meaning she's experiencing alcohol withdrawal. Carolyn suggests Mary go up to the Britannia pub and quell her thirst. Mary tells her she just tried to drink some ale but threw it up. Carolyn will be adamant about this meeting with police later, although she will admit she didn't know Mary very well. Carolyn sees Mary about 9 outside the pub with a man wearing dark clothes and a plaid coat. At 10, Maurice Lewis sees Mary in the same pub, drinking with a group of people. At 10:45, John McCarthy, Mary's landlord, sends Thomas Indian Harry Bowyer to Mary's room to get her rent money. Thomas knocks, but there's no answer. He then sees the broken window, so he puts his arm through and moves the jacket and curtains. That's when he sees her. The Times newspaper will later say this murder looked like the work of the devil. Thomas runs off in search of a policeman. He goes to Commercial Street Police Station and tells Inspector Walter Beck and the constables the horrors he's just seen. Beck goes to see for himself, at which point he sends Dr. George Bagster Phillips and sends the Telegraph to Scotland Yard asking for assistance. Beck has never seen anything like this. Neither has Phillips, who arrives at Miller's Court at 11:15. Inspector Aberline arrives shortly after. At 1:30, Superintendent Thomas Arnold, head of H Division, after having the door broken through with an axe, sees how much blood there is. It has soaked the bed through, as it has the pillow, after the killer cut Mary's carotid artery in her neck. In the room, a fire is dying down, and the remains of clothes and a bonnet are in it. The spout and the handle of a kettle have burned in the fire. Aberline immediately thinks the killer made this fire for lighting. Dr. Thomas Bond, the well-known police surgeon from A Division, and Dr. Phillips examine the victim. Despite the witness testimonies, these men will say when they found her, stiff with rigor mortis, she'd been dead for many hours. Dr. Bond will say she died at 2 or thereabouts, so the testimonies of the people who saw Mary after that will mostly be ignored. The mutilation this time was almost beyond belief. Here is just some of the incredibly lurid autopsy report written by Dr. Winnie Baxter. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all around down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts, the uterus and the kidneys with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on a table. This was the work of a madman at the height of his depraved escalation. It was the nuclear explosion of obscene murder. Dr. Bond said it wasn't the work of a skilled surgeon or even a butcher, just the work of a very disturbed individual. It was so brutal and so wicked that the public wanted answers. The media reported that one man seemed to think the whole thing was funny. He walked down the street claiming he was the Ripper. He was soon arrested at the corner of Wentworth Street and Commercial Street near the last crime scene. The paper wrote, 2 young men, one a discharged soldier, immediately seized him, and the crowds which always on a Sunday night parade this neighborhood raised a cry of lynch him. Sticks were raised and the man was furiously attacked. On November 9th, Met Police Commissioner Bloodhound fan Charles Warren resigned under pressure. James Monroe, former CID head, would take over on November 27th. Mary was buried on November 19, 1888, with Joseph and a handful of female friends in attendance. Her family did not attend. On her gravestone it was written, "In loving memory of Mary Jeanette Kelly, none but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever." Jack the Ripper is thought to have stopped after this murder, but we also have to ask if he had anything to do with the Thames Torso murders. From 1887 to 1889, police found 5 dismembered bodies of women. Only one was ever identified. Sometimes parts of the body were found, but not the head. The Times said this about one of the murders: "The division of the parts showed skill and design, not, however, the anatomical skill of a surgeon, but the practical knowledge of a butcher or a knacker. In one case, a woman's torso was found on Tuesday, September 10, 1889, under a railway arch in the Whitechapel area. She'd been beaten, which wasn't Jack the Ripper's style, but her abdomen had been cut open, which was. Had the Ripper not stopped? Between 1857 and 1890, there were rarely more than 400 murders a year in London, and during the 1890s, the rate was usually below 350 a year. That's still more than the present day, with London from 2018 to 2023 seeing anywhere from 118 to 144 homicides a year. So there were more murders than the canonical 5. They may or may not have been related, but police then and still today say only 5 really had Jack the Ripper's footprints on them. Still, even the last one, which this time was of a younger woman, not outside but in her home, and with total overkill, may have been a different person. Some have blamed her partner, Mr. Barnett. Barnett had identified his former partner by her eyes and ears, since there wasn't much of her face left. But was it him? An envelope possibly belonging to him was found at the murder scene of Annie Chapman. It showed the letter M.S.P. and the number 2, and his address was Miller's Court, Spitalfields, 26 Dorset Street. There is speculation that it was he who Catherine Eddowes was about to out, but that's all it is, speculation. He was of Irish origin, and the From Hell letter contained what looked like some Irish dialect. He looked like the Ripper and lived in the area, but maybe the cops left him alone because he wasn't certifiably insane. As we know in today's world, the Ripper wouldn't have acted crazy. Barnett actually fits the profile the FBI came up with many years later. Also, the door was locked when cops arrived at the murder scene, meaning the killer might have had a key. Aberline questioned Barnett for 4 hours. Already idle rumors said he'd killed her out of jealousy or as an evil way to tell her that she shouldn't prostitute herself. Aberline said nonsense. Barnett was innocent, he said. Police interviewed over 2,000 people, investigating 300 of them and detaining 80 of them. At the end of that, they said they still had no idea who the killer was. Aberline had his theories, although he once said, "We're lost in theories." There were so many of them. Aberline had one suspect he particularly liked, George Chapman, a Polish-born killer of 3 women in London. Born Seweryn Klosowski, later studying practical surgery at the Warsaw Praga Hospital, Chapman beat his mistresses, poor women, and killed 3 with poison. And oh boy, did he fit the description of a dark-haired man in dark suits with a dark mustache. Still, the Ripper killed strangers, not lovers. He mutilated, not poisoned. Chapman was a violent misogynist, though, and a killer whose wife later said would often go out for many hours at a time. He lived in George Yard and for a time on Whitechapel Road. He was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 7th of April 1903, the same year Aberline started saying that he was the Ripper. Robert Milne, who was for a time the Metropolitan Police Directorate of Forensic Services, wrote in a paper that he presented at the International Association for Identification Conference in 2011 that Chapman, like Aberline had suspected, was Jack the Ripper. We won't go into detail for all the many suspects, but here's a rundown. Was it the Oxford-educated Montague John Druitt? His own family thought it was. This upper-middle-class man drowned in the Thames not long after the last murder. He was possibly depressed and unhappy at having to hide his homosexuality. But why is he accused? It's partly because of Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten, who called Druitt sexually insane. Remember, this was a time of rife homophobia. The evidence against him was circumstantial, and even today, Druitt doesn't seem like a suitable suspect for many Ripperologists. In his famous memorandum, Macnaghten also mentioned Michael Ostrog, a Russian conman. Macnaghten also wrote, "Unquestionably a homicidal maniac." He wasn't, and no serious investigator today thinks Ostrog was the Ripper. But Macnaghten's third choice, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew and a hairdresser who ended up in the asylum after threatening his sister with a knife, was a better suspect. Well, it certainly seemed that way in 2019, when a paper published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences said it had proved through DNA taken from Catherine Eddowes' shawl that Kosminski was the Ripper. Still, some scientists have refuted the findings. There's more evidence supporting this theory, which is why Russell Edwards, author of Naming Jack the Ripper, said he is absolutely sure Kosminski was the Ripper. One of the world's most famous crime writers, Patricia Cornwell, said she was sure who the Ripper was too. For her, it was renowned artist Walter Sickett. This impressionist certainly made an impression on Cornwell. She said his mitochondrial DNA matched that from one of the 600 Ripper letters sent to Scotland Yard back in the day, and she said after studying the man and his obsession with Jack the Ripper, she was sure it was him. Still, other crime writers have said she is well off the mark, and as police are sometimes prone to do, she led her own investigation with tunnel vision. There's the Liverpool cotton merchant James Maybrick, whose diary the scrap merchant Michael Barnett made public in 1992. Maybrick had lived in London at the time of the murders. The diary entries describe the murders in Whitechapel ending with, "I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell, what love can do to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." Still, that all sounds a bit too convenient, and Barrett had admitted in the past he created the diary, although he later retracted that. Also, the journals show inaccuracies with the murders that have been commonly made, as if someone was making the entries after reading what's on the internet. That's why the general consensus is that the diary was forged. Then there's the pocket watch, which like the diary has been tested by scientists for its authenticity. The watch, found in 1993, was made in Leeds in 1847 or 1848. This is true. It also is true that the inscription says J. Maybrick along with I am Jack, as well as showing the initials of the 5 canonical Ripper victims. Nonetheless, a smart person with time and money could have faked those inscriptions. Scientists can't be sure. It's just too hard to tell, even when you have an electron microscope. In terms of proving beyond any reasonable doubt, there is no jury in the entire world who would find any of the suspects put forward by so-called experts guilty. Some of the theories are just outlandish, but suit a certain fantasy such as rich men killing poor people, since evil aristocrats make for compelling stories. Was the Ripper Prince Albert Victor, as some have said? The prince wasn't even in London for most of the murders. As for John Bernardo, the wealthy philanthropist we mentioned who founded the charity for deprived children, he also makes a good tale, but there's no real evidence for him being the killer. The American Francis Tumblety is another suspect, a man once arrested for involvement in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, an unashamed misogynist and hater of prostitutes who was staying at a boarding house in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. He used to keep women's wombs in jars and show them off to friends, people who knew him as the doctor who had potions that could cure everything. Yes, he was a snake oil quack, something of an American psycho who had brushes with the law in the UK and the US. One of his friends later said, "Knowing him as I do, I should not be the least surprised if he turned out to be Jack the Ripper." He was a scammer, possibly with psychopathic tendencies, and the Whitechapel police were looking at him as a Ripper suspect, although they might or might not have tried to have him extradited. It seems not, and anyway, the New York City police, who admitted to having him under surveillance, said there is no proof of his complicity in the Whitechapel murders, and the crime for which he is under bond in London is not extraditable. His crime in London was gross indecency, having sexual relations with another man, which was illegal. As for being the Ripper, was he too tall at 5 feet 10? Would witnesses not have said something about this outlandishly big mustache? He was dodgy, but not that dodgy. The fact of the matter is, there are no solid cases against any suspects. Maybe the Ripper crimes were not committed by one man, but a few men. Regardless, we hope we've shown you today that another interesting part of the story was the state of Victorian London for the poor. Now that was criminal.